Good morning and welcome to all our guests from South Africa and also from the rest of the world attending the inaugural SACAA, the South African Civil Aviation Authority's General Aviation Accident Reduction Seminar. So the purpose of today is really to share much needed safety information as it relates to general aviation in particular. And of course, we have many speakers that will be taking us through some presentations. So I'm not going to get into too much of detail on this specific seminar. Our first presenter will be sharing much more detailed information. But I'd like to welcome you all, and I do hope that you stay with us for the duration of this morning. We hope to conclude at 12 o'clock, but I do promise you this will be very valuable and very enriching to your flying careers, your flying lives, and of course your personal life. So before continuing, we know this is an online event for this year. So a few rules. The first thing is when you do enter the meeting, please do rename yourself so that we know who is in the meeting room. And if you're a company delegation, please also show your company name. If you are an individual, please show your name and surname. And of course, if there's a company that you'd like to represent, please show their name as well. So you will not be able to unmute yourself. We have our backstage team that will be assisting us with the process of Q&A. And of course, the Q&A will only be able to happen over the chat box. So if you look at your screen, you will find the chat box. Please keep the session interactive. If you have any questions, please do raise them, and we will only have about 15 minutes for each Q&A session. So we'll take out many questions as we can, and address those during the Q&A session. But please also make your comments during the presentations, and let's keep it as interactive. The purpose of today is, of course, safety. So during the Q&A, of course, there might be questions which we'll not be able to answer during the session, but straight after the session, we will do our best to address those questions. But please keep them during the Q&A for the benefit of all attendees. So with those simple steps, at the inaugural SACAA GARS seminar, we look forward to this participation, and we also look forward to all of our presenters this morning. If you look at our agenda this morning, we have much esteemed presenters, and they look very forward to presenting to our good audience. With that being said, I hand over to our first presenter, who is Mr. Neil de Lange. So to start off, Mr. de Lange is currently the Senior Manager for General Aviation at the South African Civil Aviation Authority, and is here today in his capacity as Project Leader for the GAS, also known as the abbreviated form General Aviation Safety Strategy. And this is a project designed to improve the GA safety environment and consolidate CAA initiatives and drive towards keeping the skies safe. With that being said, I hand you over now to Mr. de Lange.
Thank you, Program Director. I appreciate that. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the South African Civil Aviation Authority, I'd like to welcome you to this online General Aviation Accident Reduction Seminar, also known as GARS. This project is one of 9 deliverables of the overall General Aviation Safety Strategy, forming part of a 5-year drive aimed at reducing accidents in the general aviation sector, which is far less regulated than, for instance, the traditional and more safe airline sector. The target is to reduce general aviation accidents by half over 5 years, but even if one life might be saved, it would be all worth it. That life could be yours. The adage, "There is no new accidents, only repetition of past ones," that we often heard from the late great aviation protagonist, General Des Barker, holds true. We need to ask ourselves, why do we keep seeing the same old accidents continue to happen with notorious regularity? Part of the answer lies in the lack of accident prevention training, and part of the solution is hopefully that we are trying to accomplish here today. While upholding safe standards and maintaining skills, the right knowledge and attitudes are vital, as reports show that accident-prone pilots remain at a loss to identify, manage, or eliminate the causal and contributing factors that lead to accidents. To remedy the situation, educational guidance material have been developed by the General Aviation Safety Strategy, the focus group which deals with fixed-wing and rotor-wing aircraft operations respectively. The educational guidance material is intended to standardize the contents and the delivery method of various presenters, some of whom are safety specialists representing the SACAA and others, hopefully growing number of presenters from the aviation industry. For each GARS seminar, a selection of topics contained in the EGM will be covered. Each of the scenarios are based on tragic real-life events assessed within the general aviation context. The criteria include the severity, probability, and frequency of each accident, as well as the likelihood of behavioral modification. The topics can be classified under the following taxonomical categories and are loss of control in flight, also known as LOCI, controlled flight into terrain or CFIT, extreme flying accidents, high density altitude and overloading, and undue domineering influences or UDI. 2 helicopter scenarios and 2 fixed-wing aircraft accident scenarios will be discussed today. Attendees will also be taught the benefit of understanding concepts like the critical cross-field outcomes. The learning benefit is to grasp how an occurrence in one aspect of flight might have an enhanced influence on another and how these interdependencies work. The learning benefit, the EGM will lay the groundwork for the future advanced flying and management. Aspects like aeronautical decision-making and the threat and error management will receive due attention. Overall, the development of airmanship, crew resource management, especially in the single pilot environment, and captaincy have not been neglected. In the chapter on undue domineering influences, attendees will learn how to contend with the phenomena of pressure being applied on the pilot by, for instance, a very demanding owner or boss that may be aboard. The scenario dealing with high density altitude and overloading will demonstrate the interdependencies. Widespread misconceptions are also addressed, as well as concepts like the relationship between high bank angle and the exponential rise in stalling speed. And the G-loading are discussed in a way that may be an eye-opener to some who may have passed the theoretical concept, but who still do not fully appreciate how it still claims pilots' lives. The audience will be equipped with the relevant indicators and criteria to effectively assess each accident. Attendees will then be placed in a position to not only ask what the accident pilots should have done differently, but what they would have done in the same situation. Part of the process of what we are doing here today is to cultivate the necessary managerial skills and discernment to ask the right questions before each flight, and to understand how various factors interplay and change as the flight progresses. To develop such skills to ask the right questions and gauge their level of understanding, attendees will in later seminars be asked to answer multiple choice questions. We trust that GA pilots will not only enjoy these seminars and find them meaningful and that they add to their confidence and resilience, but that the takeaways will always be a safer general aviation culture, heightened accident awareness, better preparation and decision making, improved attitudes, improved captaincy and airmanship, better equipped GA pilots, and a vastly reduced general aviation accident trend. From the above, you can deduce that a lot of critical thinking and analysis has gone into preparing the presentations focused on the identification and management of pilot risks. You will see and later here today. As mentioned earlier, the General Aviation Safety Strategy is a concerted initiative by the CAA to address safety in the GA environment, with a holistic approach. Although it is a CAA program that is approved by the executives of the SACAA and the implementation is coordinated by the General Aviation Department, the various focus groups are open to industry participation. In fact, the more participation we have from the industry, the richer the discussions and the better we are able to address our safety mandate. Allow me to also share some of our other focus areas which forms part of the GA safety strategy. We have trend monitoring. It's a focus group that monitor the involvement and research projects with a view to establish the effective implementation of the General Aviation Safety Strategy. We have safety outreach, which you may have seen the various Skywatch publications aimed at sharing safety articles and initiatives. The focus group also arranged the recent National Aviation Accident Week, which took place at Stellenbosch and Kitty Hawk during October. Then there's the Devolution of Powers focus group. This group looks at measures to enhance community responsibility and to consider regulatory amendments for this purpose, by and large expanding the footprint of the SACAA by involving our industry partners. Then there's the RPAS in the GA airspace environment. Now, this focus group works closely with a larger RPAS liaison forum, which has a particular focus on educational and awareness of safety matters. There's the development of general aviation activities. With this focus group focuses on a safety mandate and asks the question, can we maximize safety without developing the industry? There's also the medical support focus group. Now, this group will only commence with their activities next year and will concentrate on enhancing support to both the medical personnel and flight crew alike. With these focus groups, we explore the 9 deliverables contained in the General Aviation Safety Strategy. Please enjoy this first GAR seminar with us, and please share your feedback with us to enable us to constantly refine our seminar delivery to ultimately make our skies safer. With that said, I thank you, Program Director, and I look forward to listen to the various experts that we've lined up here today. Thank you very much.
Well, we thank you, Mr. De Lange, for sharing with our audience the much work that's going into the gas. And certainly from all that we've heard, it's a tremendous experience to be part of that, I'm sure, for everyone involved. And what I hear from you as well is you would like others to get involved in this, and certainly that's a good initiative as well. We thank you, Mr. De Lange. With that being said, our dear audience, this moves us into our first official presentation now that we understood the background of the gas and together with the SCARS event, the General Aviation Accident Reduction Seminar. And our first presenter with the technical topic will be Dr. Andre Coetzee. And I'll tell you a bit more about Dr. Coetzee. He owns one of the largest helicopter training organizations in South Africa and is also an experienced designated flight examiner. He's got many thousands of hours in training and flying helicopters, and beyond this, he also has an engineering degree and a PhD in business management. Finally, he's also the convener of the Helicopter Safety Group. So Dr. Coetzee will be talking about helicopter loss of control, a very important subject. I'm sure many of us are looking forward to hearing more about this. And straight after Dr. Coetzee's presentation, we will move into a Q&A. And again, a reminder on the Q&A is please do use the chat box during the presentation or even straight after the presentation, and Dr. Coetzee will be able to assist us in answering some of those questions. So for the audience that joins us today, I'd also like to remind you that this event is being broadcast live both on the CAA's, the South African Civil Aviation Authority's YouTube site as well as its Facebook site. So you may also join using those platforms. With that being said, I hand over to Dr. Coetzee.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you for this privilege of addressing you, but more so addressing a very pressing issue in aviation. specifically resulting in aircraft accidents, and this being loss of control in flight, or lock-eye. Before we start, and perhaps just the philosophical motto, aviation is essentially not about flying, but it's fundamentally about landing. And as cheesy as that might sound, you'll realize that that is the truth of what we're busy with every day. What we're going to do today is have a quick look at loss of control, specifically in flight, but also in life. We're going to look at a definition and scenario. We're going to look at some concepts being spatial orientation, loss of visual reference, control loci, situational awareness, a very important one. A different philosophy on safety being safety 1 versus safety 2, threat and error management, aeronautical decision making, and then a clinical assessment, and we'll look at the impact and takeaways of what we've been busy with today. I thought of throwing this in. We always see the romantic side of flying, the beauty of flying, the Tom Cruise Mavericks days of flying. But what does it look like when it goes wrong? If you have a look at that first picture, that is a beautiful AS-350 Squirrel helicopter. And a day later, we see the antithesis, a scene of disaster, calamity, the aircraft destroyed, and one person died on the actual scene. You'll notice there's a lot of foam, there's mayhem, there's pandemonium, and obviously the heartache of losing someone on the ground. This was through the loss of control. The pilot lost control of the actual aircraft, and to that extent it ended up in an absolute disaster. If we look at slide 2, a very familiar Robinson R-44 helicopter, again in pristine condition in front of the hangars. And the second slide shows us exactly what it doesn't look like, what we don't want it to look like. Literally a day later, that same helicopter in a pile of spares in full view of patrons at Rand Airport at the Harvard Cafe. An absolute tragedy. 2 people died in a flame ball, and something no one wants to behold. The third slide is our Bell 407 scenario that we're going to be looking at today, and the SACAA report is recorded under 7191 for you to read and obviously peruse afterwards. A beautiful Bell 407 in all its glory, and the 3 smaller slides below show us the calamity again and the disaster that followed after this helicopter hitting the ground at 45 degrees nose down and virtually nothing left of it, including 2 lives that were lost of the owner and the corporate pilot. What is the definition of locus of control, or the loss of control in flight? An unexpected loss of visibility and ultimately control of the helicopter through external orientation aspects. What does that mean? A dark night, bad weather, or just loss of control through another means? If we look at the scenario, this Bell 407 accident in front of us, this happened on the 28th of April in the year 2000 on a farm located 10 nautical miles north of Beaufort West. The pilot and the 1 passenger departed in darkness on just after 6 in the morning and took off to fetch a family member, obviously with a high expectancy in Oudtshoorn. The weather was fine and was forecast to have a few fog patches in the area. And when one looks at the temperature, the dew point temperature versus the actual outside air temperature, there was no split. It was both at 3 degrees, meaning that the likelihood of fog was pretty great. The helicopter was overdue on its ETA and the family started getting worried. They phoned around, but to no avail. No contact was made. And more or less 10:30 local time, more or less 4 hours after the takeoff, they found the helicopter 400 meters from the homestead. So it didn't even happen far from where they took off. Aboard was a well-known and well-renowned, internationally known eye surgeon. He was the owner of the helicopter. And he was flying with his company pilot, a seasoned CPL with a night rating. And this guy had just short of 2,000 hours, of which 730 had been in the last 12 months. So he was proficient and current and by no means behind the curve. Why would this happen? Why would the helicopter end off in a pile of spares on a dark farm? The probable causes noted by the SACAA report showed either spatial disorientation, vertigo, or loss of visual reference to the ground, the so-called black hole effect. Just one more picture of this absolute sadness and the tragedy that followed and the destruction that this helicopter left behind, more so the loss of life. Let's look at the factors that were highlighted by the SACAA report. Firstly, spatial orientation and a short definition thereof. This is the pilot's ability to constantly discern and integrate his position in space relative to other aircraft, geographical landforms, weather and airspace. I've noted the antithesis there as well. What if you don't have all these conditions? It ends up in spatial disorientation. That's all external factors. In terms of an internal orientation aspects inside the cockpit, what do we have? It's the location and layout of engine and flight instruments, switches and avionics, the amenities, lighting and control functions of our aircraft. The so-called saying of "I'm behind the aircraft." Automation nowadays is a major contributor to this. We're now going to have a look at a short video on spatial disorientation, the onset thereof, and again, the nasty outcome.
The moment an aircraft flies into the clouds, pilots no longer have any outside visual references that can give them a sense of direction. Because of that, they may have the feeling that the aircraft is flying horizontally, while in reality it is banked and making a turn. This feeling is called spatial disorientation, and it can be a contributory factor in serious aircraft accidents. Spatial disorientation is an overpowering feeling, one that a pilot can only overcome by systematically checking the flight instruments. But if a pilot is distracted from the instruments and he guides the aircraft by his senses, sensory illusions possibly form a serious threat. That's because in flight, the organs of balance give the pilot misleading information about the aircraft motion and orientation. Boeing and TNO have now developed a tool which can analyze and visualize the dangers of spatial disorientation. SDIT compares the actual movements of the aircraft with the calculated perception by the organ of balance and creates a visual representation of the differences. SDIT enables accident investigators to analyze recordings of the aircraft movements prior to and during aviation accidents in a better way. In the future, the tool could even prevent accidents by operating real-time in aircrafts and warn pilots when a risk of spatial disorientation is being detected. At the moment, TNO is working within the AOLA's Human Performance Innovation Program with Boeing and other parties in order to expand the model to visual illusions, which will make the tool suitable for helicopter operations in situations with reduced visibility.
Our second video shows what the loss of visual reference look like. More often than not, we think of that as only flying into instrument meteorological conditions. But a very dark night has exactly the same effect on our senses. And the lack of visual reference typically ends up in tears. This video clearly shows the issues surrounding IMC and where the pilot and the passengers found themselves.
Confusion appears to be the cause behind the deadly Mount Disappointment helicopter crash which killed 5 people in March. Investigators have released their first findings and now the victims' families want change to save others from the grief they're still feeling. Here's Adam Hegarty.
For the families, for a brother, no closure brings them back.
We're all struggling with it, really. I still don't understand the decisions that were made on the day.
At least, though, an explanation as to what caused the deaths of pilot Dean Neal and passengers Nicholas Vasudeva, Paul Troja, Ian Perry and Andrew's sister, Linda Woodford. Thick cloud that should have been avoided.
That is flying using visual references rather than instruments.
The doomed chopper was flying 3 kilometres behind another. The first pilot noticed a wall of cloud merging and broadcast on the radio, U-turn, U-turn, U-turn. But as the first chopper turned, Dean's helicopter went ahead beneath them into the cloud. It then turned left and down before hitting a tree trunk, plummeting to the ground.
It was probably descending to try to get below the cloud up top, but obviously the cloud was already on the bottom.
The other pilot suspects the respected Dean was confused by the U-turn warning. He'd replied saying, "Aren't we going to cut through?"
I'm not sure why, and I don't think we'll probably ever find out why.
No defects were found, so microflight helicopters stay in the sky. But the investigation is not over. Next, they'll be trying to download vision and audio from the crashed helicopter's camera. And no doubt, it'll be a harrowing watch.
Lessons can be learned. Once again, being cautious as the place to be when flying, so that no other family has to go through what we have.
Adam Hegarty, 9 News.
Those two videos show the harrowing side of when it goes wrong and the destruction that follows. If we come back to the control or the loss of control, we've been looking at a flight scenario only, but what does it look like in our lives? Is it only involved with flying and through our entire existence? If we look at the term volition in a life scenario, this is one's own, using your own will to do things, to execute. And there are two distinct facets that we look at. The first one is an internal locus of control. In that sense, we assert and retain control of situations. So we make it our own. We assume responsibility and accountability. There's also an external locus of control function, which is typically attributed to luck and or other person. So someone in this position or with this volition will never take responsibility of his situation. It's always someone else's problem. I don't have luck. I never have opportunities, which is hardly ever the case. What does situational awareness mean? If we look at this slide, that looks pretty impressive. A BO-105 helicopter, upside down, abeam the Statue of Liberty. And that takes the continuous cognitive and physical management of very complex variables, as you will agree, in that specific maneuver. Now, can that be taught or learned? And the simple answer is no. However, it can be gauged. And there are four measurable elements to accurately evaluate this situational awareness. The first one being your performance. That can be evaluated externally by your peers, by an instructor, by an examiner. That is also always done through subjective ratings. So very often an instructor would have an opinion as to your conduct and also your situational awareness with whatever you're busy with, in our case specifically flying. We can also do this through simulation, in a simulator, in scenarios where we need specific outcomes or expect specific outcomes or not. And then physiological factors. Can I physically handle this? In this case, you can clearly see that the pilot can handle it. He's obviously very capable, proficient in what he's doing, and he's got all faith in himself and the machine. A different philosophy to what we used to in our existence and perhaps in our aviation careers, and that is the safety one philosophy versus the safety two philosophy, which was devised by Professor Erik Nolnagel from Norway more or less 10 years ago. And this makes for fascinating reading and something that I really cherish and like. Our normal day and our existence, particularly aviation, pivots around safety events. At times, we focus on that only. So we have days and days and years, perhaps, of no safety issues. However, when there's an incident, an accident, even a hazard, the focus becomes that. And the left-hand side of that curve in the screen shows that. That's the safety one focus. Our lives are programmed to focus on what has gone wrong. However, safety two philosophy looks at what is going right. What are we doing right every day by virtue of just being here, of having arrived safely at our destination, of having lived through another day? Surely we've done something right. And that's exactly what safety two proposes. It's quite difficult to judge because it goes well. The causality functions are quite difficult as well to gauge. However, safety one is fairly easy because it's an outlier. You can see on both sides of the scale with the so-called tails of probability. When we get to a problem, we tend to pinpoint that very quickly so that we don't do the same or don't fall into the same trap again. Whereas safety two looks at what we're doing well and improving on that every day. If we look at threat and error management, holding hands to what we've just discussed, and specifically towards helicopters, we look at threats which are typically external and beyond our control. Examples for helicopter pilots, and I'm sure you're well aware of that, would be weather, power lines, high density altitudes, mountain flying, turbulence, the ones we've had a look at now, inadvertent IMC, and specifically on dark nights. What would the errors then be that we find ourselves challenged with? In this case, it will be pilot or crew-based decisions, or perhaps the lack thereof, that leads us up a rabbit hole and ends up in tears. And the crew's actions in executing these decisions that we've made. The abbreviation below that is ADM, or aeronautical decision making. So we've had a threat, we've perhaps had an error or not, but how do we base our decisions on more respectable data? In this case, a distinct knowledge of SOPs and applicable legislation. What does the law say? What does our company operations say? What does my own ethos say? Assertiveness. If I've made this decision, am I pushing through at all costs, or am I reassessing as I go along? Which leads me to the third point there, the continuous assessment of the situation. So once a decision is made, an ADM decision, do I just stick to that or do I constantly assess that? So there's a feedback loop to constantly improve my precarious or safe situation. If we have a look at a critical assessment of what we've discussed today, and just briefly so, by looking at the scenario that we've seen earlier, what could the accident pilot or the owner have done differently? There was obviously psychological pressure to pick up the passenger at a specific time, almost regardless of what the weather looks like. I think that would have been a poor call, and it ultimately ended up with a calamity. And then if you were the pilot at home, where we're sitting now in the comfort of our homes, would you have acted the same in the same situation, or perhaps differently? And then accidents with similar causes and contributing factors. We showed but 3 pictures here of beautiful aircraft, and a day or 3 later, a pile of spares. How do we change that? What would be the difference? The impact and takeaways, hopefully after today's presentation for you all, would be an improved safety culture. And I've made 3 notes there. In South Africa specifically, we come from an exceptionally lawless and ill-disciplined background, whether it's on the roads, whether it's on your boat on the water, whether it's at home. And we need to improve that through a personal improvement of safety culture, then an aviation safety culture, and then a national safety culture, so that we embody all of this in our existence and not only limit it to our aviation exposure. We need greater situational awareness. Again, whether you're driving, whether you're flying, whether you're on your boat. Hand in hand with that would be preparation, the planning and prediction towards better decision making. Back to our safety 2 graph again. How do we predict things that might go wrong when we're looking at things that constantly go right? We're hoping for better airmanship and assertiveness. Ultimately, we want to see a reduction in general aviation accident rates. What hit home for you in integrating what we did today? We've had situational awareness issues. We've looked at scenarios where aircraft end up in ground or being burnt out with the pilots having lost control in flight. I'll share with you how this hit me. This accident, the specific Bell 407 accident, happened on my birthday in the year 2000, and that helicopter was operated by my company. I said goodbye to the 2 pilots the afternoon before as they left for Beaufort West, only to be called up the next morning around 11 to inform me that the helicopter is no more, and obviously 2 lives. It had a profound effect on me, having seen that helicopter and the 2 guys literally 15 hours before, and the outcome you saw for yourselves. I thank you for your time today. I hope by virtue of seeing this has created an awareness of what we are busy with, the inherent risks we've got to manage, how situational awareness and spatial disorientation can jump on your back and be a potential killer. I thank you.
And that was, of course, Dr. Andre Coetzee with loss of control as it relates to helicopters. So we do have a number of questions to help us unpack it. Dr. Coetzee will answer a few questions for us, Dr. Coetzee. We do have about 15 minutes, so we will try and take as many questions as we can. So please continue to add in your questions on the chat box. So Dr. Coetzee, our first question this morning is in regard to your presentation. What would prevent most low-key accidents?
So Bash, I think there are a number of factors that come into play here, not a single factor. Obviously, and from what we could see in the videos now and the presentation, is that the loss of visibility on horizon, good meteorological conditions all contribute to safe flying. So the moment at night, for instance, in a dark night, we lose visual cues and visual terrain, unlit areas, for instance, we tend to lose control, and the sense of vertigo and other sensory lapses become very apparent. So I would say first and foremost, without reducing it to a single factor, would be visibility, and specifically a good horizon, whether day or night.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Coetzee. So we continue with the second question this morning. And Dr. Coetzee, so can we train for factors like vertigo, or can it only be overcome by using the instruments on the aircraft?
I think first and foremost, a form of instrument training is important. Obviously, building up to a complete instrument rating, which is 40 hours worth of intense training. Other factors would be your own volition. We touched on that in the presentation as well. Are you pushing the boundaries? Will I deliberately fly into foul weather, a dark night again? The instrument rating and the training towards that isn't a silver bullet. It's still just a license. The execution thereof, the planning, experience, learning from others. I think all of those factors are key in making you a safer pilot.
Thank you, Dr. Coetzee. And we move on. We know that weather plays a big part in aviation. How can a pilot plan for phenomena like fog and mist, as an example?
That remains a mystery in a certain sense, specifically for helicopter pilots, where we fly and operate at low level and not exposed to high altitude weather. I think the fact that we have resources at our disposal makes it a bit easier in trying to understand the weather at our destinations and for our planning. However, it's not an exact science. We don't have the luxury of weather stations in the league of the USA and Europe. And our weather changes very quickly here, especially in summer, where you find that thunderstorms and foul weather creeps up on us very, very quickly and can really spoil your day if you don't plan properly.
And what would you say in regard to accidents, the unfortunate event of an accident? Does commercial pressures or self-induced pressures play any role? Maybe you can tell us a bit more about that.
Undoubtedly. In our operation, our helicopter operation, we place a huge emphasis on reducing or mitigating that risk so that we don't leave our crews exposed to a situation where commercial pressure dictates. We always have to be mindful of the fact that the pilot in command is exactly that. He retains that assertiveness and the authority that goes along with it, despite the commercial pressure, despite perhaps mechanical issues or technical issues. A myriad of other examples exist. One's got to be very mindful of the fact that the owner of an aircraft, in the case of a corporate situation, tends to dictate what the crews ultimately do. And to manage that, to still be professional, to still get the job done, but within the realms and boundaries of what does the regulations say, SOPs say, common sense say, remains paramount.
So one of the very key items that is spoken about in South Africa now is normalization of deviance. And to some degree, this is related to the attitude of the pilot. Would you say that would be a major factor in which would give rise to an accident?
So, Bash, I think it's a very pertinent question, and perhaps taking a step back, it's not only with flying. If we look at South Africans in general, and perhaps the whole world, but specifically our nation, we have become particularly prone to this normalization of deviance. Let's take our driving, for instance. Let's take the way we deal with each other, gender-based violence. All of those tend to group and sneak up on us, and it finds an outlet valve in flying because of the freedom, the romantic side of flying, as I like to refer to it as well, that we suddenly have this, specifically in helicopter flying, this ultimate freedom of landing at your place at the Val Dam or your farm or your beach house. You're able to do this. And you get away with that once, despite the regulations, despite the fact that you know it might not be right. You get away with it. The next time round, it's so much easier. And you find that this normalization of deviance becomes the new norm. Ultimately, it tends to bite. We've seen that too many times before. And without turning into purely regulatory animals either, specifically again on the helicopter side, one's got to be very mindful of the fact that most of these regulations, most of these SOPs are written in blood, and one has to take cognizance of it and adhere to these systems and rules.
So, Dr. Coetzee, if I can ask you to perhaps expand on the last portion a little bit. You spoke about regulations and it being written in blood. You've got thousands of hours of experience, you've got a PhD, and I take it you're quite passionate about helicopter safety and GA safety in particular. With regard to regulations, there's sometimes a very contrary view that regulations perhaps make it make flying and the whole experience very bureaucratic. What would you say are the benefits to compliance to regulations as best as possible, as best as an aviator can possibly comply with regulations?
I think for a start, we are creatures of habit. School children need to be disciplined and educated within a specific framework. And as we grow older, this expands progressively. I agree with your remark that it can turn into a bureaucratic nightmare. And the old adage, in the 1976 ANRs was one little file. It's now 8 or 9 Bibles that we've got to adhere to. And how to incorporate that? My personal view on this, it has to be more practical. What does the system require? A set of rules, any set of rules requires a policeman. So with that comes an additional burden on the regulator, on the police, for instance, whoever that person or entity might be. It comes with a huge responsibility as well. So by creating more laws, you're actually creating more policemen as well. And perhaps back to the normalization of deviance, as long as there is a lack of conscience, we're going to find more and more rules being applied or generated, created, whereby we should actually, as far as I'm concerned, revert to a more conscious-based and practical solution to why these regulations and rules are implemented. That includes SOPs for companies as well.
Perfect. So you spoke also about airmanship, and this seems to be quite a key focus point for a safe flight. One to consider airmanship, a person having good airmanship and bad airmanship. Can you tell us a little bit more about what would you regard as good airmanship? When a pilot boards an aircraft, what would you regard as good airmanship?
I think it's a very difficult question with not one single answer. If we are to ask a panel of, regardless how many people, you'd have as many different answers and opinions. What I like in my own life, and it goes beyond the flying only, is consistency and leading by example. The old adage again of what you're doing when no one's watching. That to me is profound. Are you willing and able to take your family along in your own helicopter, in my instance, as to when you're flying by yourself? Would you be or consider yourself as safe and as proficient and as disciplined as you would with 5 or 6 persons on board? So airmanship alone by itself, I don't think there's a single answer. It obviously has to do with knowledge, skills, your general attitude, your approach to your flying, the planning, the way you go about your maintenance, pre-flight. All of these things form part of it. And the sad reality is you could have thousands of flying hours, but it changes within milliseconds, and you are remembered for that, how it ended in a pile of spares or perhaps with a loss of life.
Anecdotally, and this is related to what you've just been mentioning right now, from your own experience, we know that human factors does play a crucial part in aviation, especially for the flight crew involved. Our human civilization, South Africans are not exempted from this, and this has happened throughout the world. We've been through a period of COVID-19. We're perhaps still in COVID-19, there's still infections, but there's been economic shifts, there's been many material shifts in the global economy, in the global way of the way things are done. Would you say that any of that has had any impact upon a pilot's mindset when he boards an aircraft? And if so, what advice can you give to such a pilot who perhaps is not in the best mind space to take a particular flight?
Subhash, I think it's a very pertinent remark and question. We certainly saw it in our own operation during the part of hard COVID lockdown, the frustration that pilots had, not being able to even run your own aircraft for a maintenance test flight or just a ground run. And I think undoubtedly it led to a lack of recency by definition, a lack of currency, and also a sense of desperation, frustration with more rules, more regulations, not being able to buy a warm chicken, open shoes. We're all familiar with that. But the knock-on effect into flight safety, I think, is profound. Strangely enough, we've also seen it on the maintenance side. So not only the classic pilot error side, which we try and avoid, but the human factor side that spills over into maintenance. The number of maintenance-related issues in aircraft obviously stems from not being able to run these engines. They're just bolts and nuts and oil, regularly flying them enough. So not only on the human side, you also have the mechanical side, the man-machine interface. And I think a lot of these accidents that we see or have seen and incidents flow from that. Desperation, frustration, lack of proficiency.
We're almost at the end of your Q&A, Dr. Coetzee, but we did speak about regulations and the need for regulations, and they should not be too bureaucratic. We have spoken a lot about accident reduction. I'd like to ask you, in your own view, would you believe that accident reduction training, a specific training course dealing with accident reduction, do you believe there would be any value add in making such training compulsory for pilots, or do you think perhaps this may be leading to over-regulation?
Perhaps a bit of both. I firmly believe that specifically in the private pilot sphere, there should be more exposure to this. The commercial guys and airline guys, perhaps even more, are exposed to CRM, to dangerous goods, SEPT. There are a lot of other abbreviations that we can carry on with. But the private pilots are essentially left to their own devices for 2 years. An instructor would see them every 2 years, at which point they have to prove that they've only flown 2 hours or 3 hours perhaps, and then do the license revalidation. I'm a firm believer of lifelong learning, but also continuous learning, and perhaps to incorporate an awareness, again in a practical sense, rather than a regulatory sense, where pilots feel, gosh, I don't want to miss out Saturday's presentation at Rand Airport or at Stellenbosch or in Virginia. I want to be involved with this fraternity. I want to learn more. I want to get more exposure, even if it's hangar talk and it's the pizzas and beers afterwards. I think that sense of camaraderie will go a long way in sustaining this. Obviously weaving in why accidents still happen, why the same accidents still happen, why we're seeing the same nasty pictures on the internet, and how I, as an individual, can become more involved and adding value through what I do, my airmanship, my attitude, my knowledge, my skills.
Excellent. So we're at the second last question, and this is from the floor. So we know that pilots may have certain preferences towards different types of aircraft or helicopters. And would you say that the choice of aircraft or helicopter for a particular pilot would have an impact upon whether, or an influence rather, as to whether there would be an accident that would become more likely?
I think there's fairness in that question, specifically relating to the complexity of the machine. For that reason, and perhaps there's a dichotomy of some sorts in there, that underpowered old aircraft are used in flight schools, and the most experienced pilots end up with the most sophisticated aircraft. The way the world is changing and technology certainly shows us that aircraft like Slings, for instance, have got very fancy cockpits, which was unheard of a couple of years ago. So I agree with that. The level of complexity, especially at the beginning of flight training, can be overwhelming. Saturation to the student pilot, not being able to deal with all of it. Having said that, the younger generation nowadays is so au fait with technology and the interaction between man and machine, it can actually add value. Finding that balance, I wish I could give you the answer. I'd be a very, very wealthy man.
Well, indeed, that's very true. With technology, a lot has changed. And this takes us back to human factors. Has the human being changed as rapidly as technology, specifically in the cockpit? So the last question for you, Dr. Coetzee, is implementing a regulation where human factors would become compulsory for PPL pilots. Would that add any benefit in your view? Do you think that would be something which is necessary from all that you've seen from your experiences of late?
There is at the moment, in terms of the theoretical syllabus, a human factors exam. But I feel it can be expanded vastly in terms of the practicalities thereof. More so perhaps a mentoring function from the instructor side. They're not becoming an instructor that gives instructions, but becoming a coach and mentor, which would obviously mean that instructors will have to be developed and be au fait with what's required of them. So I believe there's merit and value in that. Definitely on the human factors side. Perhaps another anecdote on your annual medical or biannual medical, there's one question only on human factors, really. Have you ever attempted suicide? Out of perhaps 50 or 60 blocks that have to be ticked. And I think that also gives us a bit of a guideline as to where the focus is at the moment. The physical side of us must be fine, but is our mental health okay? And the factors that drive it, without turning students into patients or having to turn them into academia. That's not the point. But I think learning more about yourself, the interaction with others, multi-crew cooperation, single pilot CRM, there's huge value in that.
Well, this brings us to the end, Dr. Coetzee. We thank you. You've put so much enthusiasm into all that you've done today in the GAS seminar. Really passionate again about helicopter safety. And we do thank you for getting into so much of detail.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, this brings us now to our next presentation. Again, to our audience, for those of you who would like to again watch Dr. Coetzee's presentation, we are broadcasting live on YouTube and Facebook, and you can also go back into those applications and you can find the video there, and at any of your convenience, of course, you may watch the video again and refer back to the Q&A. So our next presenter is Mr. Karl Bolweg. And Mr. Bolweg is currently a flight operations inspector at the South African SACAA and is also an airline pilot. Mr. Bolweg started his career as a pilot at the SAF before joining South African Airways, and he flew various large aircraft, both domestically and internationally. So he also served on numerous international committees during his time at the airline. And Mr. Bolweg today will be telling us a lot more about high density altitude and overloading. So again, please don't forget to add in your questions on the chat box. This is definitely going to be a very interesting presentation, another interesting presentation on high density altitude and overloading. With that being said, I welcome Mr. Bolweg.
We all know that loss of control in flight, or lock-eye, is one of the leading categories of causes of accidents. But we always think lock-eye is continuing VFR into IMC conditions where the pilot loses visual references, or flying in the vicinity of a thunderstorm. But overloading an aircraft or loading it in such a way that the center of gravity is out of limits can also lead to a loss of control. As long as you can close the door, the air will fly. Yeah, okay, not always true, but you have to ask yourself the question, why do some pilots overload an aircraft or load an aircraft in such a way that the center of gravity is out of limits, knowing that it could kill them or their passengers? Are they ignorant? Or have they forgotten what they were taught? Or have been doing it so long that they become blasé? It won't happen to me. It's a bad attitude of invulnerability. In October 2008, the pilot of this Piper Lance took off from runway 35 at Rand Airport. There were 6 people on board. They got airborne at about just after 8 in the morning. Temperature was only 18 degrees Celsius, QNH of 1023, which gave a pressure altitude of 5,180 feet. Now, with the outside temperature of 18 degrees, the ISA deviation was 13 degrees, giving a density altitude of 6,740 feet, effectively making the aircraft overweight by 260 pounds. As I said, they eventually got airborne. The climb out was not really as the pilot had expected it to be, and he soon realized something was not good here. So he opted to aim for a field. He lowered the gear, informed air traffic control that he was going to carry out a forced landing. On landing, the aircraft hit a pile of rubble, flipped over, and burst into flames. When emergency services arrived on the scene, all they found was the burnt out wreck and the charred remains of the occupants. A preventable accident with a sad loss of life. The aim of my presentation is for you to achieve a better understanding of the effects of high density altitude and the dangers of overloading. I'll be looking at the following: the duties of the pilot in command. Now, if you look at the Civil Aviation Regulations, Part 9102.7, it names 21 duties of the pilot in command. I will only be concentrating on 2. What is density altitude? Effectively, it is the pressure altitude corrected for the ISA temperature deviation. The effects of density altitude? Well, the higher the density altitude, the poorer the performance of the aircraft. Simple as that. We'll look at a couple of calculations, nothing higher grade, and we'll also look at a graph or a table from a Cessna 210 manual. Then I also want to look at weight and balance. Overloading an aircraft comes with a variety of problems. We'll quickly highlight that. But it's not just about how you load the aircraft, it is also how you distribute the weight. And that I will quickly discuss the effects of it. Too far aft. Let's have a look at the duties of the pilot in command. You can read these for yourselves. Now, I'm not here to throw the book at you. It's not my style. But you have to ask yourself the question, what was that pilot thinking when he chose to ignore the regulations? After all, the regulations are written in the blood of those who got it wrong. I love aviation, and I'm sure you all do. And I see no reason for someone who is passionate about aviation to be threatened by regulations. You should be motivated and proud enough to say, look here, I've done all the work, what it takes to ensure that this flight is going to be safe. I've made safety my highest priority, and we are good to go. So let's have a look at the effect of density altitude. If you look at the diagram on the left-hand side, now remember here, this is for a constant volume or a given volume. So the picture on the left-hand side is where the atmospheric pressure is a bit lower, and therefore the distance between the particles are further apart, hence lower density, compared to the one on the right-hand side where the atmospheric pressure is higher. You can fit more particles into this given volume, they're closer to one another, and the air will be more dense. Now, if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, once again, same volume, but if one where the temperature is higher, the particles have more energy, they're bouncing against one another, and they are further apart. Hence, lower density. But how does this affect the flight? With more dense air, as you can see the particles are closer, you can fit more air into the engine. You can fit more airflow, there's more airflow around the propeller. The propeller biters more. There's more airflow over the wing. So the engine produces more power. The propeller produces more thrust, and the wing generates more lift. Remember we said that density altitude is the altitude, performance-wise, where the aircraft thinks it is. Now let's put that in numbers. For a decrease in pressure by 1 hectopascal, that equates to 30 foot on average, up to 5,000 feet. And for each degree Celsius increase in temperature, the density altitude increases by 120 foot. Now that's C for serious. Now this picture should be nothing new to you. Here we have an aircraft getting airborne at sea level using just over 700 foot takeoff run, compared to an aircraft at a pressure altitude of 8,000 feet where the takeoff run is slightly more than double. But what you should remember here, this is only the effect of pressure altitude, not density altitude. So for a rule of thumb, as a rule of thumb, you could say for each 1,000 foot of increase in density altitude, the takeoff run increases by 10%. And for each 1 degree Celsius above standard, the takeoff run increases by about 12%. So remember, the higher the density altitude, it's going to affect the engine, the propeller, and the wing. So let's have a look at a density altitude calculation. Nothing higher grade here. So example is we have a QNH of 1023, an elevation of 5,500 feet, outside air temperature of 25 degrees Celsius. What is the density altitude? So step number 1 is determine the pressure altitude. Step number 2 is correct for the temperature deviation. So determine the pressure altitude. So we take the difference between the QNH, which was 1023, and the QNE, 1013, that's 10 hectopascal. Remember we said earlier on, for 1 hectopascal equals on average 30 foot. So 10 hectopascal, 300 foot. So what is the pressure altitude? We said that the elevation is 5,500 feet, and that's at a QNH of 1023. So where would 1013 fit in? Obviously, it's a lower pressure, so it'll be higher. So this difference is 300 foot. So elevation, 5,500, 300 foot difference. So you're looking at a pressure altitude of 5,200 foot. Okay, now remember that. So now we must look at what is the ISA temperature at a pressure altitude of 5,200 foot. So ISA lapse rate is minus 2 degrees per 1,000 foot. So for 5,000 foot, lapse rate will be minus 10 degrees. ISA temperature, sea level, 15 degrees Celsius, a lapse rate of minus 10. That will give you a ISA temperature at 5,000 foot pressure altitude of 5 degrees. But we said in our example that the outside air temperature is 25 degrees Celsius. Therefore, we're looking at an ISA deviation of 20 degrees. Remember we said 1 degree is 120 foot. So therefore 20 degrees, 2,400 foot. So there we go. We're looking at a pressure altitude of 5,200 foot plus the difference there in temperature of 2,400 foot will give us a density altitude of 6,800 foot. Here we've got a table from manual or from a Cessna 210 manual. All these manuals, whether it's a Cessna or a Boeing or an Airbus, they are all based on pressure altitude. So all you really have to do is to find out what the pressure altitude. But if you forget what the sum is, all you can do is you go to the subscale of the altimeter, dial in 1013, and the little hand and the big hand will show you pressure altitude. So just as an example here, we've got a pressure altitude of 5,000 foot. If you come across here for 20 degrees and you look at now at 30 degrees, on average there for 10 degrees, you're looking at 200 odd foot, 60 meters. 60 meters, wow, that's 3/4 of a football field. See where it becomes really important. But now, I have a question for you. You've looked up this figure. Is that your final answer? I have a question for you. How proficient are you? How current are you? Can you guarantee that you can handle this flight? Are you proficient enough to handle all the challenges of this given flight? I'm sure you're familiar with this I'm safe table or the I'm safe rule. I just want to highlight 3 of them. Stress. We all know that if we're under stress, our memories are affected and our decision-making capabilities are affected. Fatigue. How good or how bad was your last sleep opportunity? If you are fatigued, your cognitive skills are affected and your decision-making abilities are worse. Emotions. We all know if you're not in a good space, things easily go pear-shaped. So, would it not be prudent to have slightly increase our personal limits, just to be ready for that curveball, just to buy some extra time for that startle factor? I would say at least 10%. This slide here looks at the effects of temperature on indicated airspeed and true airspeed. Now, as you know, indicated airspeed is measured by the pitot tube and the static tube, whereas true airspeed is the actual speed of the aircraft through the air. Now, for ISO conditions or under ISO conditions, indicated airspeed will be exactly the same as true airspeed. But as the altitude increases, the density of the air decreases, therefore indicated airspeed decreases. Now, in order to fly the same indicated airspeed, the true airspeed has to increase. Now, we did mention that the true airspeed is effectively the speed of the aeroplane through the air. Because it's higher, the aircraft has more energy, kinetic energy. It will have more momentum. And this will come to effect when it comes to stopping distance after landing. So take, for example, a pilot is accustomed to fly into a lodge early morning. Now there was a delay for whatever reason. Now he's flying into the same airfield, but in the afternoon, at the hottest part of the day. And he's going to be in for a surprise because the aircraft will have more momentum, and if he's not ready for it, there could be a possibility of a runway excursion or a runway overrun. Now, it's not just the weight or the load of the weight, but it is also how the load is distributed. So let's look at, first of all, an aft center of gravity and then a forward center of gravity. So if the center of gravity is too far aft, the moment arm, or the distance between the center of gravity and the control surfaces, in this case the elevator and the rudder, is less. Therefore, the control effectiveness will be less. And this could have an effect on the stall recovery. It could even make a spin recovery impossible. What happens if the center of gravity is too far forward? Now, with a forward center of gravity, to balance the downward force of the tail, that effectively increases the weight of the aircraft. Once again, making it heavier, affecting the performance. Let's have a look on the takeoff run. With a forward center of gravity, because of the weight, the elevator may not be effective enough to rotate the aircraft off the ground. Same as for the landing. It might not have enough elevator force to get the aircraft into a flare. Be it as it may, for a forward center of gravity, the takeoff distance and the landing distance will both be increased. What about single engine operations on a twin engine aircraft? With the center of gravity as aft, as I mentioned, the moment arm will be shorter. The rudder will not be that effective, which once again could affect, or not, the rudder may not be effective enough to control the yaw of that inoperative engine. You may have heard people say to you, be safe out there. Make safety your highest priority. Be alert. Your country needs alerts. But those words mean diddly squat if you don't have any tools. So I hope that during this presentation that at least you got some tools to go out there and make better decisions, make better pre-flight planning, and then you can fly safer. So your take home here, low pressure plus high temperature, i.e. hot and high, equals high density altitude. High density altitude, lower or poor performance. The engine won't produce that much power. The propeller won't produce that much thrust. The wings will generate less lift. Overloading, remember when you overload an aircraft, you exceed the structural limits of the aeroplane. Incorrect loading, it will affect the controllability. And you might not be able to get out of those difficult situations. So, now you've got the tools. Now you can go out there. When someone says, be safe, make safety the highest priority, now you will be able to do that. And that's all I have to say about that. Thank you for your attention.
Well, this brings us to our next Q&A session, and as Mr. Bolweg has mentioned, make safety your highest priority. We do like that, and something definitely we'd like to remember. So this brings us to the Q&A session. We'll have about 15 minutes of Q&A with Mr. Bolweg. Again, please continue to use the chat box for any questions you may have. This is the opportunity to do so. And as it relates to high density, altitude, and overloading. Mr. Bolweg, we have a first question for you, which relates to high density altitude. Does it have an impact on true airspeed or only on ground airspeed? It's a question from one of our viewers this morning.
So if you look at a higher density altitude where the air is less dense, so in order to fly the same indicated airspeed, because now the air is less dense, there are less particles going into that pitot tube. So in order to fly that same indicated airspeed, you actually have to fly at a higher true airspeed. As I mentioned, true airspeed is the actual speed of the aeroplane. So yeah, what was the question again? Oh, the ground speed. Okay, the ground speed, yes. Okay, so now, if there's no wind, your true airspeed will be exactly the same as the ground speed. So it's still true airspeed, the actual speed of the aeroplane. It's basically, it's the amount of energy, the amount of momentum that aeroplane has. So the higher the true airspeed, it's got more momentum, comes to a landing, you need more braking, and if you're not prepared of that, if you're not aware of that, there could be a possibility of a runway excursion or runway overrun.
Mr. Bolweg, you've
Carl.
also, Carl, I'll call you Carl. Thank you, Carl. You've spoken about overloading and also high density altitude. Does weight, altitude, and temperature all have an effect on the safety of an aircraft? We've got a question from one of our junior viewers this morning. Perhaps if you can elaborate and tell us the impact upon those elements.
So I'd like to go back to that graph or that table I showed there. So you know the weight of the aircraft is. You know how much fuel you've got, and you know the weight of the passengers, and you already weighed what luggage you're taking along. So you know your all-up weight. So when you enter that graph, you enter at the actual weight of the aeroplane. From there on, you look at what the density or the pressure altitude, and once you've got the pressure altitude, you can correct for the density altitude. So that, if you look at the graph, it will come to a number, and that will say, whatever it is, say 2,700 meters. So that answer, what you have there, is determined by the weight of the aeroplane, the pressure altitude, and the actual temperature. So now the question is, okay, but the runway is 2,700 meters for argument's sake, but the graph says I need 2,800 meters. Can you go? Clearly not. So what can you have to do? Then you have to make a decision. Who's staying behind or what's staying behind? And that usually is the problem because people don't know how to say no. They've never been trained how to say no.
So a pilot in an aircraft often experiences very strong winds. Does that have an effect on high density altitude, and how so?
Well, no, density altitude is really just the temperature. So the wind that will affect the ground speeds, because remember we worked on the true airspeed. So if there's no wind, the true airspeed and the ground speed will be the same. So if you've got a headwind, you're still flying the same true airspeed, but your ground speed, your speed over the ground will be less because of the headwind in that case. So, but to answer your question, wind, no. It's just temperature that will affect the density altitude.
Excellent. And we understand overloading is a big factor in the safety of any aircraft flight.
Yeah.
And if it's such a big issue and everyone understands it as being an issue which affects safety, why does it still happen in your view?
I think it amounts to pressure. If you look at the aircraft, the load, or it's a limitation. It's an aircraft limitation. The manufacturer says under these conditions, let's say temperature conditions, under certain conditions, this is what the aircraft can do. This is what it's meant to do. Remember I said that density altitude is where the aircraft thinks it is under the present conditions. So you can just imagine, you're going away on a charter or a jolly with a family and friends like that, and people arrive with these huge Delcies and whatever. And the guys go, that's not going to work. Now, how do you convince your passengers or the boss or the owner of the aircraft that is, I'm not going to do this? Stick to the facts. Says, look here, the book says under these conditions, this is what this aircraft can do. In fact, this is what it's limited to do. You expect me to load this stuff? We probably can do it. However, if something goes wrong, it's not going to be good. So just say, listen, these are the facts. This is as we always underestimate. You know, you are the pilot in command. What does that mean? That you are the boss. The buck stops here. And if you're not happy with it, just say, this is not going to happen. Not on my shift. And unfortunately, people have forgotten or they don't learn how to say no. Remember, you're the boss. You're the pilot in command. The buck stops with you. These are the facts. I'm not prepared to take a chance.
So what you're referring to is very much pressures out in industry where a pilot is being forced, perhaps by a superior, to take the aircraft into the air whilst knowing there's some overloading that's perhaps not right. This is a very material issue which affects safety. And what advice would you give to such a pilot where the pilot is being forced by their superior to fly the aircraft? What advice from your years of experience, Carl, would you say to them?
Stick to the facts. If the book says you can't do it, don't do it. That's it. You're the boss, the buck stops with you.
Perfect. So we have another question. And this again takes us to high density altitude, Carl. Will departure at a specific time of day affect high density altitude? As an example, leaving early in the morning.
Of course it will, yes. So when it's cooler, remember I said density altitude it's affected by the temperature. So yes, you plan a flight departing early in the morning, but you know what it's like. There's always a delay. There's always a curved ball. And so you end up going later. Higher temperature, higher density altitude, lower performance. So now the game has changed. So because you may have done your homework the previous evening, says, okay, this is all good, this is how it's going to be done. But now there's a delay. What's happening with the delay? So there's first of all, I said it's going to affect the performance of the aeroplane. But with a delay, is come, we need to go. And what do? You don't go and revisit your performance calculations. See how it becomes a race to the bottom if you don't slow things down.
Indeed. And again, this points to there being a correlation between pressures and overloading, workplace pressures in the case of a pilot. What mitigations would you say are in place in regard to overloading? Here's a pilot, he's about to board an aircraft and he identifies this aircraft is overloaded. But what mitigation should there be to prevent such a circumstance from occurring?
What, from a passenger point of view or from the actual pilot saying?
So if you look at it from a pilot perspective, but also from the entire operator perspective, where there are rules governing the specific operation, what would be the mitigations that would prevent a scenario where a pilot is about to board an aircraft, he identifies it's overloaded? And of course, I take it those would be very important factors to be mitigated.
Well, the pure fact that you are exceeding the limitations of that aeroplane, I mean, that's a given. These are the facts. We are exceeding the limits. I'm not prepared to do it. Don't say I will find someone else, because you will find a sucker to do it. But that's it. We must be professional. You know what they say about safety is doing the right thing even when someone is not watching.
And finally, Mr. Bolweg, or Carl, as you asked me to call you, what advice would you give to aviators? You've given a presentation to us on high density altitude and overloading. Just in summary, your own experience, you've gained much wisdom, certainly. In your own words, what would you say to a young pilot that's coming up the ranks? He or she wants to be a safe pilot, but of course they need a mentor. What would that mentorship advice be from Carl Bolweg?
Do your homework. Be prepared. Look at all the options. And at the end of the day, you must say, listen, I've done all the preparations. I've looked at everything, and now we are good to go. You've ticked all those boxes. I hate that expression, but you've done everything, and you must be convinced, 100% convinced, that you've done everything to ensure that this safe is going to be a safe one.
Excellent. We thank you, Mr. Bolweg, or Carl, as you like to be called. This now brings us to our first and only refreshment break, given this is just a morning session, and we hope to conclude by 12 this morning. So we will take a 15-minute break. In this time, please feel free to stretch your legs, but we do hope that you make it back at 15 minutes past the hour right now, and we look forward. We'll continue then with our next presentation straight after the break, which will be by Mr. Kobus Turin. With that being said, please enjoy your break, and we'll see you in 15 minutes. So welcome back from the last refreshment break, and we continue the session this morning, and of course today's events are purely aimed at improving general aviation safety. So we really do appreciate everyone attending the session, and of course again the session will be on YouTube and Facebook, so please do also share with your peers this information, that they may access the CAA's website on YouTube, or their channel on YouTube, and also their Facebook site, and of course they can gain all of the information and continue to spread the message of safety. So our next presentation, also very topical this morning and very relevant to the last presentation, which deals with undue domineering influences in all operations, and I'm sure this is one where many of us will have much to say. This will be presented by Mr. Kobus Turin, and Mr. Turin has flown many types of aircraft, including the Mirage and the Cheetah fighter jets at the South African Air Force. He was also manager of flight safety at South African Airways, and also commanding officer. He's furthermore a lecturer in aviation safety, so he does take his presentations very seriously, and he's very eager to join us this morning on undue domineering influences. So straight after the presentation, we'll again have a Q&A session, and I'll remind everyone again to please continue to add in your questions, and Mr. Kobus Turin will therefore be in a position to answer those questions. With that, we move straight into the presentation.
Good day everybody, and thank you for tuning into GARS, what we call Module 5. Today we're going to discuss UDI. Now I know UDF, UDM and UFOs, but I didn't know about UDI until Johan Lottering recently asked me if I will please present on his behalf. So I'm quite honored to do so and discuss UDI, and the more I read through this and the more I worked through this, the more I realized that this is something that we should all know. We do know that, but we never gave it a name. So underlying principle of GARS, I'm sure you've seen it, the late General Des Barker always said there are no new accidents, only repetitions of previous ones. Personally, I also believe that there are no new accidents, and we spend many hours talking about why are we having the same accidents. So what he also says, early recognition of accident participating factors are the key to prevention. So if we can recognize what's going wrong and we know where things might go wrong, we might be able to prevent them from happening. The overview, very quick, the aim is exposing a serial killer in aviation, And I'm sure you will agree with me, undue domineering influence is what UDI stands for. We'll give you a broad definition, how to recognize, and some scenarios as well. Then the second objective is concepts, cross-field outcomes, human factors, also threat and error, and then how to mitigate this, and decision-making process, how does it follow. And then lastly, a self-assessment about captaincy and airmanship. Just very quickly, the airmanship, remember the three parts, it's knowledge, skills, and attitude, and I'll refer to it as we go along. And then there's just a short timing slide for the presenter, which is most probably going to be, not the presenter, the program director of my friend Subhash. So the aim of the presentation is exposing a serial killer, and we mentioned that, to help general aviation pilots to recognize, better understand it, and also see how it influences your decision making and whether it's legal or not, and then how effectively you manage UDI when encountered. And I'm sure many of you have already encountered UDI events. The definition, in short, is pressures, there's influences, and it compromises the safe outcome of a flight. Now, in more detail, it says a collective set of pressures and influences, external or internal, on the cockpit or the pilot, single pilot, and the sound planning, operational and aerodynamical decision-making and judgments are impaired or compromised. And so too the legitimacy and the safe outcome of a flight. Now, undue, if I can quickly stand there with my English, I was always said, education is important, for me flying is importanter, and that's but my English. So under undue, it's excessive, it's unjustified, unreasonable, or even inappropriate pressures put onto especially a pilot in command. When we talk about spheres from various areas, I'm using a slide that comes from the airline industry, but there's no different to general aviation. There's informational influences, a lot of them. There's environmental influences, like the weather, the changes in weather. And then there's organizational influences, and I think here is where we can put UDI in, because there's always somebody that makes your mind up for you as a pilot in command, and we should not allow that to happen. Personal influences, what's happening at home, unfortunately, always comes to the cockpit. And I know management expects you to leave your troubles at home. It just doesn't work like that. And I know, and you know that. The only difference maybe here, in the airline they have cabin crew, and only one cabin crew comes to the cockpit, where you have passengers, direct contact with the passengers. They might be sitting next to you, right behind you. So just a broader view of influences. And more detail, we can look at recognition of UDI. Usually it says there's two heads in the cockpit. But with two heads in the cockpit, sometimes you can get very good information. But the problem is when they get to two-headed monster, then who makes the decision? The captain or the owner? Usually it's not only the owner, it could be your client as well. So the problem is, it emerges in terms of decision making. Who makes the decision? Who's got the ultimate say? Now you and I know that the pilot in command's got the ultimate say, but it doesn't work like that, not all the time. So let me show you a quick example. Here's a case study. It's a Britain-Norman Islander, which is occurred on the 5th of October 2008, in which 9 people perished. The pilot was under extreme pressure to fly despite expressing concerns about the weather before the witnesses. And he mentioned, and it's in the investigation report, everybody at the lodge, he spoke to everybody, said, guys, the weather is not good to fly. But the owner of the aircraft, they had time constraints. They had to get back to work. A long story short, and the kids had to go back to school. So there's time pressures, but now the time pressures from the owner became the time pressures of the pilot. Now this was also not the original pilot. The pilot that was going to do the flight, he injured his legs. So this poor guy had to do a quick conversion in 3 days period of time. And therefore he was under even more pressures. And that's why we want to look at UDI. How does that work? So the probable cause, it's a word I don't like. Probable cause, it's from SACAA. And probable cause, there is no cause in saying, now I'll read it. The pilot flying a VFR certified aircraft encountered adverse weather conditions and en route during a VFR flight, and which resulted in a CFIT, a closed flight, a controlled flight into terrain near the top of the mountains. Now, if you look at probable cause, there's no cause in there. That's just what has happened. But anyway, that's a discussion for another day. We need to find out why accidents happen. If we only know what has happened, you do not do prevention, and that's why we're still having the same accidents today. Now, there's a long discussion. There's a lot to say about it's all in the investigation report. But something else that came up, overloaded for grid Mora. In other words, on one engine. If that engine failed, they were too heavy. These are little things that creeps in as well. Now, whether the pilot was even aware of that, I don't know. It doesn't state so in the investigation report. Then all the other things, no weather radar, no GPWS, are things that you will not find in the Norman Islander, which is a VFR certified aircraft. The question is, why would a pilot then fly a VFR certified aircraft into IFR conditions? And that's actually the question we're looking at. I mean, ultimately you had to make the decision. If you look at the trees as well, you can see flow straight on level at the top of the mountain, straight into the trees, not even 20 minutes after takeoff. Now we're looking at influences. There's internal and external. We already discussed the differences, but internal influences, you look at intimidating owner-client. And I'm sure all of you have flown with an intimidating owner or client. And especially if that owner or client is also a pilot. Usually not with the same expertise as you, otherwise he would have flown it himself. So he's got a lot of say in the decision making, which he should not have. It's not regulations, it is undue. In other words, it's inappropriate and it's not safe. Pressure to complete the mission on time. I think we all do that. This is our job. We do the job on time. And if things don't work out, we have to make amends. And unfortunately, that means sometimes taking shortcuts. I'll give you some examples now. Lack of captaincy, airmanship, and threat and error management training equates to one thing, a lack in experience. KSA, skills, knowledge, skills, and attitude. Now, if you don't have the right attitude, you're not going to have time to pick up all the skills. You're not going to have time to pick up all the knowledge. So you're not going to get to that experience. External influence is basically where we're coming into UDI. Performance pressure, building a career. I know my son is there at the moment, building hours. And you know, it's unfortunately that it's something that's such a driver that becomes a UDI. It's undue because there's pressure, it's domineering, and it's influencing your decision-making process. Social pressure, does not want to be cowardly. Now, we're not cowboys. Pilots are not cowboys, but we also don't cry in front of the horses. And this is unfortunately that pressure is always there. Peer pressure, how to be a better pilot. There's insecurity as a pilot, eager to please. And this is a dangerous one as well. If you always want to please the client, they're always going to use you. You're going to end up like this poor guys in the Norman Islander. Moral pressures, I mentioned already, the guys had to get back to office and the kids had to get back to school. So their time constraints become the pilot's time constraints. And in the investigation, it clearly says how he asked them, please, let's delay for a bit. Let's delay for a day. And it says, no. They says, well, let's delay for a few hours and the storm will move away. So eventually the best he could do was delay for an hour, and that was it. And then they went out flying. Now, if we take a look at the circumstances of UDI, there are quite a few. There's authority, judgment, decision-making abilities of the pilot or crew. And these are challenged, contradicted, or undermined in disregard of a safety-first approach. In other words, there's undue, domineering influences. And one thing that we usually see is that the less experienced the pilots are, the bigger this UDI can become. This pilot in the Norman Islander, he had 275 hours. He had a CPL, a commercial pilot's license. He had 9.6 hours total on the type. Now, that is scary if you think about that. Anyway, so let's continue. Let me show you some examples in airline operations. On-time departures. I always say on-time departures in the airline operations become a cancer in the airline industry. And I know passengers want to know what time you're leaving, and everybody sits on the watches and they say, okay, we're going to leave takeoff at 7. You don't take off at 7, that's when you push back, and that's where passengers see. And if it's not, then it's not a good airline. Nobody asks how good is the airline's safety records and safety statistics. They just work on on-time performance. And it's up in the posters. This is the best airline because the best airline on-time performance. Even in helicopter flying, I don't know helicopter flying that well, but I know it well enough that the UDI on helicopters example I use is flying with the trackers. When they try and find a vehicle, it's at night, it's a call out, it's unplanned, it's sometimes they're under the TMA in Johannesburg or Cape Town. And the poor guy is usually a CPL guy that's trying to build a house, trying to do as best as he can. And you find that the tracker guy is a very senior guy, but he's not the pilot in the command, and he's usually not a pilot. So the problem is he tells him to fly left and right. That's no problem. That's what he should do. He's a tracker. But to tell the guy how to fly left and right, that's not up to him. So there's a lot of undue pressure on the pilot, and eventually it ends up in an accident. How does it manifest? Well, I think we discussed it quite a bit already. So I'm going to read this. It culminates in different taxonomically classifiable accidents. And yeah, the common denominator is a deliberate pressure on the pilot. and it could manifest as loss of control in flight, control flight into terrain, overlanding accidents. There are actually quite a few that we can add to it. Something that comes out now, stream flying accidents are, by example, self-induced. Now, that does not mean an air shows, for instance, where everything is so rehearsed, it's so well done, it's by professional crews. We're talking about a guy that takes off an unplanned, he just decides on an impulse to maybe must give like a beat up around, turn around, come in fast and low, and then he has an accident. So usually at your air shows you find there's very professional guys. There is rehearsals, it's running like a time clock, but you can still have an accident there as well. So more indicators: excessive mission, focus, orientation. If there's one thing I've learned, even in a time of the Angolan conflict, in a war, if you don't put safety first, why bother going out? Okay. And I know sometimes you have to take chances, you have to take risks. So when we talk about indicators of UDI, there's the one that always stands out: excessive mission, focus, orientation. Now, excessive means you're going out of your way to make it work, and unfortunately that's when the problems start. We have, even in the Angolan conflict, if you do an operational sortie, we go out, we try and put safety first all the time. Not always easy, but what's the point if you can't get home safely? The no way out commitment to a flight, and we see it a lot. A friend of mine said, well, he had to fly the group of people because the rugby was on, and PE, whatever, the Springboks were playing, and there was bad weather. He had an IF rating, so they picked him up and they went. And that's a no way out commitment. You're committed, you're going now. And something I mustn't forget to say, not having an IF rating is one thing. Having an IF rating doesn't make you bulletproof. It just gives you a better chance of surviving the weather. And then the third one is to split locus of control and decision making. The question is, who makes a decision? And ultimately, the pilot in command is the one that makes the decision. But it doesn't help that the decision was made for him by peer pressure, or not even peer pressure, by undue domineering influences. There's a mission objective superseding safety. Similar if you go into an operational context, contingency planning is secondary. Forget about contingency planning. It's an issue that we don't look at plan B, plan C, and plan D. We just go ahead. Many accidents happen because information was available and not sought, or it was given and ignored, or a pre-programmed course of action was followed without any further thought. So we need to focus. We need to focus on all these influences that makes up UDI. Some more indicators: pilot crew, intimidated, pressured. We spoke a lot about that, how easily pilots can be pressurized and intimidated. And the younger you are, the more you're going to get being intimidated. Discretion, secondary. This is also an issue that only you can say. If you say no, it's a no. Over eagerness to please. I mean, as a youngster, you just try and do everything. As you grow older, you realize, okay, you can try and do everything, but you have to do it safe. If you cannot do it safe, don't do it. That's where sometimes your judgment's questioned as well, or there's a culture of normative deviance. Now, this culture of normative deviance is similar to that organizational pressures. We call it practical drift. You can call it normalizations of deviance. Work is done as work is imagined to be done. And those also create a huge UDI. Critical cross fields, and I like the way Johannes put this up. It's if you drop a stone in the water, the ripple effects, and it goes faster and faster. And it's the same. They call the crossover effect in all aspects of flight safety. Once you make the first mistake, and you don't go back, and you don't track back, or you don't use contingency plans, this ripple effect just goes faster and faster. And then there's a disregard of flight safety. Human factors, groupthink. This is interesting. It's called a mode or type of thinking in which the group members and clients, etc., group members, the clients, so they're part of the group, share such strong motivation to achieve consensus that they lose the ability to evaluate alternative points critically. Wow. You would think that the group consensus must be that they want to fly from A to B safely, efficiently, and have fun whilst doing it, and no other way than that. But now the group consensus means everybody agrees with it and everybody's happy with it. Where if just agreement means that I'm not happy with it, but I will go with the decision. How can the group make a decision for the pilot in command? And again, the consensus, a strong motivation to achieve a consensus is the wrong one mostly, especially if you let the group partake in a decision-making process. In airline flying, we call it TGI, task group individual needs. Which one's the biggest? Task is always the biggest. To get from, and I use the example, from Zurich to Johannesburg safely, efficiently, have fun whilst doing it. Now that the group is happy, the individuals are happy. They want to go there safe, have their drinks, have their food, everybody's happy. But what happened was in that specific flight, not so long ago, one of the cabin crew had a seizure. So immediately now this synergy changes because the individual need becomes bigger than the group or the task need. So the task need changes to, in this case, they diverted to Barcelona to comply with the individual need of getting her in a hospital as soon as possible. Still doing it safely and effectively. Having fun now is not part of the equation. But now the group and the task group and the group are happy to do that as long as it's safe. They know they're not going to be on time at home now, but unfortunately they didn't make it in time. Just that's a TGI concept. Another characteristic of a group think is the illusion of invulnerability. Isn't that so true? When the group decides this is the right way to go, who can be wrong when we're all right? An inability to make significant errors as a group. So you think your clients, your packs, everybody's happy. I'm not saying you don't ask your packs what would they like, what would they like to see, what don't they like to see. But this is not what it's about. It's making the ultimate decision as the commander. Rationalizing and discounting information, it's the view of the group, or is it eventually the decision of the commander? Stereotyping the views of others. In other words, the pilot enables the group to disregard contradicting opinions. So if you cannot stand up and say, no, this is the wrong decision, I'm the pilot in command, then you're heading for a fall. So the relevance of the groupthink is pilots are often subjected to the will of the group. And this group pressure, I tell you, it's big. And the bigger the group, the bigger the pressure. Now, imagine you fly with the president of Poland, who is on his way to the funeral of a Russian minister in I think it was a TU 154 with 96 people on board. And they couldn't get into Smolensk was the city because of the weather. And the president said, you shall land there in Smolensk, otherwise they're late for the funeral. So on the third attempt they landed, but a few miles short of the runway. All 96 people perished. So they were now late for the funeral, but they were in time for their own funeral. Typically applies to commercial, corporate, it typically applies to every pilot in whatever you do. You find this even in giving instruction where you've got this CEO of a bank trying to fly and he thinks he knows better than the grade 2 or the grade 3 instructor. Disrupted cockpit authority gradient, I think you know what we mean by that. Usually you have a very steep gradient because the commander is the commander and here's the student. And it grows a little bit when you get a pilot and a very competent co-pilot, the gradient should become shallower. But now it actually tips over to the other side where you find that this is the owner or the client, he's got more influence than the pilot in command. And that's where you get your UDI at worst cases. So some audience participation, and Subhash will take over if he's the program coordinator. Critical analytical assessment are the big words. The question is, what would the accident pilot have done? What could he have done differently? Think about it, and then we'll get to the answers soon. The other question is, what would you as a pilot do differently in the same situation? So that is the other question to ask. Then we get to the last part, and threat and error management. Prior awareness and early recognition. I think we spoke enough about that. Setting a pilot discretion prevails preconditions. So setting a pilot discretion prevails preconditions. In other words, the preconditions General Des Barker spoke about. See where things can go wrong. That domino theory, where the things can go wrong, and have a plan and commit to the plan, the right plan. Better knowledge of applicable legislation. Wow, that's a tough one. But if you know your legislation well, you can actually tell the guys, listen, by verbatim in the legislation, it says that the decision ultimately rests with me as the pilot in command. So working only for owners companies who endorse the pilot's final say and authority, that's a tough one. If you know your clients, and you know that they are usually nice people to work with, and if you say yay, it's yay, and if you say nay, it's nay, always fly with them. But don't do if you know these people are always putting pressure on you. They will always put pressure on you. They've got their money and time. There's a lot of issues they have to cater for. Practicing captaincy and command decisions. Well, a lot of places say, listen, we don't hire skills. We can teach you skills, but we hire attitude. How do you practice captaincy and command decisions? Unfortunately, by flying every day and making the right decisions all the time. Now, we're all humans. We don't always make the right decisions. But don't let someone else push you into making the wrong decision, or let you follow a decision that's wrong and you can't turn back. Threat and error management equals review and modify all the time, because your decision now might not be valid 5 minutes later. Going into the weather is far, so maybe you can fly, and then you see the weather starts getting bad. Change your decision and turn back whilst there's time. How many accidents have we had in our country where the guys turned around when they were already in the weather? And then there's actually no way out. Always adhere to contingency planning. First, have a contingency plan. Anything you do, it must be plan A, plan B, plan C. And invariably D will happen, but through experience, you will have more than one plan. And I just mentioned turn back or delay if necessary. Avoid arguments, but politely and firmly stand your ground. Yes, that's an easy one, eh? No. If you sit there and you've got these clients and they pay everything and everything is done for you, it's very difficult to tell them, listen, I'm the pilot in command, it's my decision. They will try and influence your decision. But having an argument is not going to help. Maybe a tip here I can give you, which is called phone a friend. CRM, use your resources. Maybe you got the number of your DFE. Just phone him and say, listen, this is the situation, can you help me out? And let the DFE speak to him if that doesn't help. You can find somebody in the SACAA and say, listen, this is the situation. And remember, as a young pilot, maybe you don't know all these people, but know at least one or two people that you can find to help you. Admit to falling short of operational demands. And exactly in this case, they had an IF rating. He had to fly a non-certified IF aircraft. In other words, it's a VFR aircraft that is not allowed to fly in the weather. You might just have a nice instrument, but remember there was a list of things he didn't have. Okay, so another question for the audience. Can you think of accidents with similar causes and contributing factors? And I'm sure you can. And I'm sure many of you are here that can think of similar, in other words, what has happened to you and how did you survive? How did you get to be sitting here tonight? And share that with us, please. I'll appreciate that. Questions? If there's any questions, please ask your program director and have a look at discussion, have a good discussion, maybe it's a better English word, about this very important point. And then I will conclude and the impact and takeaways. Now, safety first. Now, safety first is the same as safety is non-negotiable. Safety is negotiable, trust me, but don't make it negotiable if you have the choice. It's like putting up boards, say your country needs alerts. So impact and takeaways, safety first. Now you know and I know that if you say safety first, we always think safety first. Yeah, of course we do. That's why we're still alive. But we don't really. It's the same as I tell you, safety is not negotiable. Safety is negotiable. Trust me, and that's where UDI comes from. It's the same as putting up, you see all the posters up there, be alert, your country needs alerts. It just doesn't work that way. But I would like for you to take away from tonight is the following. Safer aviation culture. How can you influence your safety culture around yourself as a pilot and in your operation? Heightened accident awareness. There's so many accidents that happen and many lessons are written in blood, but we're having the same accidents over and over. Go and read up on the accidents and try and find the whys, and then we can talk prevention. Better preparation, decision making, it comes through training. Skills, knowledge, and attitude. Chairmanship. Improved attitudes. Oh, I can speak for hours about attitudes, and I'm not talking about bad attitudes or unusual attitudes. We're talking about attitudes, a positive attitude, and try and kill the UDI. If there's undue domineering influences, try and cut it out. And the best way is, I say no. Then better equipped I almost use the word go-around pilots, but go-around pilots are good pilots, trust me, they're still alive. So better equipped general aviation pilots, that's what we're looking for. We got a responsibility as well to assist CAA in getting the accidents reduced. And a lot of you, and I myself, we lost many friends, and we don't need these accidents, please people. So better captaincy and airmanship, here it comes again, captaincy and airmanship. So that means you have to have airmanship, knowledge, skills, attitude. Bad attitude, don't have time to get the skills, won't have the time to get the knowledge either. And then lastly, and the most important, the reduced general aviation accident rate. Remember, we as pilots have to take the responsibility. You are responsible for your life, but you're also responsible for your passengers' lives. You're also responsible for the lives of those who share the airspace with you. And you're also responsible for the people that you fly over. So don't forget that. We must take responsibility and remain accountable. So thank you very much. In conclusion, rather a day late in this world than a second too soon in the next. And like I always say with on-time departures, rather depart 5 minutes late than to arrive dead on time. I thank you for your participation.
So we're now joined by Mr. Turin again for our Q&A segment, and Mr. Turin will gladly expand upon the very complex presentation, Mr. Turin, which you have presented this morning. I'll ask the audience members again to please add your questions for Mr. Turin on the chat box, and Mr. Turin is happily looking forward to answering these questions. So our first question, Mr. Turin, deals with, there's often an assumption that pilot error is a primary cause of accidents. How does UDI, undue domineering influence, impact upon such a theory or assumption?
Well, good morning, Shubhas, and please, and when I was in the military, I was told that the meneer is the highest rank that you can have. So thank you for that, but Sommer Kobus for short. A good question is, and when I hear pilot error, I see red. Because, every time you go and pick up an aircraft, you pick up the pilot. And that we're going to get to accidents soon, that you're going to go there and there's no pilot. So what now? So to answer your question, or answer the question, and I'll try and be very brief. Pilot error is when a pilot allows the manufacturer error, the regulator errors, the system errors to become an accident. And I'm not saying pilots don't make errors, make no mistake. To equate to a UDI is when there's undue domineering influences. In other words, the pilot is pressurized by, and as we discussed, to go out and do the flight, and an accident happens, then it's pilot error, because he didn't stop the sequence of events that led to an accident. And although he tried to, and this is where UDI guy comes in, you got so much control. Actually, you always have control. Remember, we spoke about command. But I know how it works. You know how it works. Unfortunately, there's so many demands, and you try and please. And that's what pilots do. We try and do the best we can all the time. And unfortunately, when it becomes an accident, then it's called pilot error. And that's I'll leave it there, because if once we go further into pilot error, I'll take up the rest of the afternoon. Thank you.
Kobus, so you are known to speak very much about pilot attitude and the importance of a correct attitude of a pilot when about to take on a flight. Can you tell us a role, in your view, of what a pilot's attitude plays towards the cause of an accident?
It's said that resilient pilots, there are two things. The one is competence and the other one's confidence. Now, what do you call when you have confidence and no competence? That's overconfidence, and that's the attitude we're alluding to. KSA, knowledge, skills, and attitude. We always talk about attitude. My kids are so tired of the word attitude, and I'm talking about bad attitude, not talking about good attitude. And UDI sometimes brings out the bad attitude in the sense that I should say no, but I don't say no. So when it comes to attitude in accident investigation, for instance, it's difficult to measure, but you always find out, yeah, I knew that guy's going to do that. So to be short on this, I think once you can instill a good, positive attitude in anybody, you're going to have a better world. You're going to have reduced accidents. You're going to have everything. The question is, how do you do that? And also remember, I'm always saying that many people say, I think Richard Branson is one. I don't hire for skills. I can teach you that. I hire attitude. And there's so many good examples out there with good attitude. We need attitude. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't have attitude like an ego. You can have an ego, but you mustn't have a bad ego. It's difficult to pin it down. But I think once you've trained, with experience comes good attitude. That is one thing. The question was asked before, would human factor training help in accident prevention? Definitely, and especially when you start at the young. I always say, catch them young, treat them rough, and don't tell them anything. But when you catch them young, you teach them well, and you tell them everything. Then you start instilling good attitude, and with experience and good attitude and knowledge, you have good emotion.
So to follow on from that, attitude is obviously very, very important. And yourself, you've flown fighter aircraft, the Cheetah, the Mirage, and you've also flown large commercial aircraft with hundreds of passengers, and you ultimately being responsible for the safety of those passengers. And the question that I'd like to ask you, Kobus, is we speak about attitude. In your view, if you had to be asked a question by a pilot about to board a large aircraft with hundreds of passengers, what advice would you give him in terms of making sure that he's having the right attitude for that specific flight to ensure that that flight continues safely?
It looks like discipline. It starts at home. And whatever happens, and I mentioned it before as well, that thing that happens at home unfortunately gets to the aircraft. It shouldn't, but it does. I mean, we're all humans. So let's start with the beginning of the beginning, and it's called mental health and well-being. Now, once you've got that sorted, and now you've got skills, attitude, and knowledge, then you get to the aircraft, and you combine all this, and now you have a happy pilot. The attitude is just, I've never seen a happy pilot being a dangerous pilot. But it takes years and years of perfection to get that. So the bottom line, when you start, know your role, know what you must do it with a good attitude, and also discipline. And discipline and attitude usually ties hand in hand. And in fact, I think it's the English word, two English words for the same thing. So especially young airline pilots coming into the airline, there's cockpit gradients. And I came into the airline at a very late stage. And one thing I realized very quickly, a lot of the captains were actually my students in the Air Force. So does it matter? No. I'm the co-pilot and he's the captain. And once you get that attitude, and my dad was very instrumental in that, the way you get brought up, there's discipline and there's respect. And once you have that in you, then you can go and start flying. I think today we lost a lot of that discipline, which is attitude. Now people say, yeah, that's cool, can't believe how bad the attitude is, or the discipline is. The bottom line, where does discipline start? It starts at home. So once you get into that cockpit, you're part of a team. But remember, the flight always starts on the ground. And when you come from home and you get to the ground, you start briefing, that's where the flight starts. And when you see somebody's not happy, something's wrong, speak up. Just speak up and say, listen, guys, I haven't got a bad attitude today. I've got a bad headache. I'm not talking about the beers or anything. And even if it's so, speak up. And that's most probably the most important thing before you get into that cockpit. Know your crew and know what your crew's mental health and well-being is as well, if that answers the question.
It certainly does. So this is from experience in a very controlled airline environment. We know that an airline has many controls, standard operating procedures. Would the same apply to the GA environment, where there's very much reduced level of control?
Yes. No, let me say no. There you need an amount of attitude, but you've got so many control measures. So I'm saying no. It's yes times 20. So once you fly on your own, and I always tell the guys, I don't know how I survived my whole military career basically flying on my own. I think by the time you get to an airline, this ground principles of attitude and discipline should be installed. In the military, it's almost different, because there, if you don't accept what it is, it gets kicked into you. And some people always say that the military. One thing we learn there is skills, knowledge, and attitude, and good attitude. And if you don't have a good attitude, you don't get in. It's as simple as that. But in general aviation, what we find is your discipline now equates around self-discipline. You're not working in a team per se. Although they talk a lot about single cockpit CRM. And I agree that the big difference between single cockpit and multi-crew is on single cockpit you're on your own. But I always say there's a minimum of 3 personalities in that aircraft. It's me, myself, and I. Now, me see a bridge, can you fly under the bridge? Myself says, yeah, you can do it. And I says, is it safe, is it legal? No, don't do it. It's 2 versus 1. So guess what happens? You do fly under the bridge. So especially with general aviation, what you require is self-discipline. And there's a big difference between self-discipline and group cohesion discipline. Strictly speaking, there shouldn't be, but it's unfortunately how it works. So in general aviation, when you fly on your own, I'm even talking about you not having other crew, you have passengers. That self-discipline is vital.
So to bind the self-discipline and attitude, which you speak about, Cobus, to undue domineering influences, would you say that a pilot's attitude should also be one which is considerate of undue domineering influences and a response when presented with such a scenario?
I think what happens with the whole discipline issue or the whole airmanship issue is undue domineering influences is starting to make it unstable. In other words, you put in a situation, this is my job, I must be able to do it. But if you know you can't do that, what are you going to do to stop that from happening? And it's not easy. I promise you, I've seen so many examples, been there myself. You try and do the job as best as you can, but now with the domineering influences coming, but you must do this, you must do that. I think I mentioned it, even in an operational context sometimes. It's slightly different, but the bottom line is you talk about safety all the time. So if you're allowed to go, how far are you going to allow it? And when do you say no? Now in the military, you don't so much just say no. But they plan and they work everything, and so it's well rehearsed. The fact that there are more guns shooting at you than was initially planned, that's beside the point. But once you get into a situation where Is it a must to fly now? Is it really? And the military always said it is a must. We must fly now. But it doesn't help you go and attack the target and nobody comes home and they miss the target. So especially in corporate flying, if you can postpone the flight by an hour or by a day or whatever, that discipline must be instilled with you. And it's so difficult. And the younger you are and the less experienced you are, it's even more difficult. And also, and we discussed it just now around tea, is a lot of times when you, a youngster, you sit there and you fly, you don't have that, what is the word called, that life experience, how to handle things. There's sometimes sneaky ways to handle stuff. We can discuss it at another time. So you don't always just have to work at yes or no. You can say yes, but, and you create good buts, which is discipline, discipline, discipline.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Turin. We continue with some questions from our audience members. So our next question is it true that the key to preventing an accident is the knowledge of recognizing such an accident or the possibility of such an accident before it actually arises?
Oh, yes. I think the late General Bess Barker, and I can't remember the right word he used, precedental. There's something, if something happens, and he talks about test flight, I mean, that's a different world. But it comes with experience, unfortunately. And with experience, you start seeing, yes, but this is not going the right way. And then you have the discipline. And because you have the discipline, it's because you have the experience. And they say, no, we're not going to follow this route. We have to find another route or don't do it. Where you don't have the experience, you might not see what's happening. So it's in life, when you grow older and you drive in traffic, you can sometimes see, but there's an accident coming. But when you're a youngster, you just don't see it. That's one of life's problems, if I can call it that.
So the next question from our audience is, it's been said before that 8 out of 10 GA pilots often overestimate their skills and knowledge. What would you say to that? Is that in some way true?
You're asking a pilot?
Indeed.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, a lot of people believe it's true. And I think if you go and you see why accidents happen, you will believe it's true. In fact, you would say it's 10 out of 10. But if you really get into this much deeper, and then you find it, but we always know what happened, but if you find out why it happened, you must probably find, but remember we spoke about this organizational influences, that pilot error thing. And unfortunately, and I mean a pilot, they say if you can't be the best at what you do, why do you do it? So to me, it's a difficult one to answer, and I want to put it in a safety aspect or perspective. If you have to have certain skills, and it's so true, it doesn't matter what you do. If you drive a tractor, if you drive home and you think you're Jody Scheckter, and you're not going to arrive at home safe. And there's another saying, he who drives like hell is bound to get there. So unfortunately, a lot of people see it as true, and where there's a lack of discipline and there's a lack of self-discipline, it could be more than 8 out of 10.
So moving away from discipline, but really in terms of proper planning ahead of a flight, and its correlation with improper planning and leading to an event where an aircraft is flown outside of the flight envelope. What are your thoughts to such a relationship?
I must get all the P's right now, because as in general aviation is big. Proper planning prevents poor performance. The Flight Leadership Dynamic Group said that proper planning with precision, or to prepare to fly with precision, I can't remember the P's. But there it's so important. Any flight starts on the ground. Any flight starts with planning, proper planning from the beginning. And as you go along, then you progress. But, if you aim at nothing, you'll hit it too. And if you don't plan, according to what plan can you fly? Some people say, if you haven't got situational awareness, how can you lose it? And that's actually facetious, but that's the way I see it. So planning, number one.
Indeed. So Mr. Turin or Querbus, the next question from our audience member relates to mentorship. And we are aware that mentorship over the last few years has taken on a much more significant impact in corporates, probably in some airline environments, not so much in the GA community though. But would you say that the industry or pilots taking on more responsibility to obtain a mentor would assist them in as it relates to UDI and safety as a whole?
No, that's a good question, because I think we alluded to it in, if you don't know what to do, who do you go to? As a kid, if you don't know what to do, who do you go to? You go to your dad and ask him. Now, as you grow up, sometimes the parents are not really the right people to ask, because maybe of the circumstances or whatever you're busy doing. The bottom line is always know who's got your back, know who you can go to. And that's what I call a mentor. And for instance, for a young general aviation pilot, his mentor could be his instructor. So his instructor is already number one that he can look up to. And don't be scared to find your DFE. You can phone the DFE. And I always say you can even phone into SACAA. Now people say, whoa, careful. I say, no, they're there to help you as well. So you find mentorships all over in the show. And I mean, if you don't know who to phone, then phone me and I'll get somebody for you, or you phone Mayday. It depends on the problem. Of course, what is an increasing problem today is mental health and well-being. Now, their good mentor would be people at Mayday, for instance. So please, youngsters, find somebody and have that somebody's phone number available. Like that Norman Islander, if that guy could have phoned his DFE or phoned his instructor, said, please, can you explain to this owner of the aircraft, this is why we're not doing the flight today. But unfortunately, that comes with experience. But if you don't have the experience, then you must be acutely aware of who's your mentor.
And Cobus, certainly you've accumulated very much experience. To expand on that a little bit, if you were approached by a pilot and such a pilot had to ask you a question, I would like to fly safe. What should I be mindful of? What should I do to keep me safe? How would you respond to such a question?
Like Sally Sullenberg said, it took him 40 years to answer that question. That's not so difficult. My personal belief is when you start flying is humility or modesty. Don't be scared to ask questions. Ask questions all the time. There are no such thing as a stupid question. There might be stupid answers, but I mean, you can't give an answer if there wasn't a question. So to become a safe pilot, we already talk knowledge, skills, and attitude all the time, but especially attitude. Excuse me. So when you fly, don't only just concentrate on what you're flying and what's in front of you. Go and read up. Get involved in safety initiatives and expand your knowledge base. With time comes experience. But if it's the same. The more you put into it, the more you get out of it. So to become a safe pilot, get involved and don't be shy to ask questions. Also go and speak to your mentors. There are a lot of flying schools. There are a lot of safety practitioners like ourselves. There are a lot of flying schools that you can go and talk with and speak up. Go and do all these courses. For instance, we mentioned as well, I know that if you do a PPL, you must write a human performance exam. But, we're trying hard to get the human factors, not an exam, but to do CRM, for instance. But no, it doesn't stop anybody to do it. The CA it's not going to, actually going to compliment you if you say, listen, I'm bringing people in to teach us CRM. Great. And I mean, if the guys are really sincere, you might even do it for free. So I can carry on. There's so many things you can do, but get the discipline to expand your knowledge.
Get the discipline to expand your knowledge.
Yep.
Excellent. So this brings us to our last question, Cobus. So there are two types of accidents. Perhaps there's many more types of accidents. But if you consider two types, an accident caused by extreme flying versus an accident caused by UDI, what would be the difference between the two?
One of my mentors is Johan Lottering, and this UDI is actually his brainwave, and I thought I didn't know what it means, but we all know what it means. It's just you put a name to it. Extreme, the word extreme already spells it out. You're doing something that's impromptu. You're doing something that's not planned. We spoke about planning. So planning is, it's planning pertinent. All the pieces must include pertinent. Must be there. It must be precision. It must be performed. And if you do extreme things like, for instance, deciding to fly underneath the bridge, that is extreme. Now, if somebody can say, okay, but I practiced it 7 times, I've flown underneath it, it remains extreme because is it safe, is it legal? I always say there's 3 ways you fly. Number 1, safe. Number 2, efficient, it's safe and legal. And number 3, have fun whilst doing it. Is it fun to fly underneath the bridge? I don't know, never done it before. But I'm not going to try and do it either. So important to understand is where UDI actually creates a situation where you're forced to make a decision which you really don't want to do. You still go and plan, you still follow your plan what you're going to fly. As unfortunately the weather might ruin it. where extreme means it's impromptu. You know, you do, and you see sometimes often air show. I mean, air shows are so well planned, coordinated. Those guys are extremely highly qualified. Now you take your aircraft now back to wherever you come from, and you think, just maybe I must also just give a low fly pass, you know, and it's like a Jody Scheckter now. And you do that and you might not survive it. So extreme, really the word means it's something that's unplanned. It's like an accident. It's unplanned, it's uncalled for, and it's always a big surprise.
Cobus, we thank you for answering questions from our audience members and also for sharing this mountain of knowledge which you have during today.
Thanks you. It's only my pleasure, and it's, I would like to talk for hours and hours on safety, but maybe at another forum.
Indeed, and we should continue the talk on safety.
We'll do that. Yeah, I'm pleased, people. Just keep it safe out there. Thank you very much.
Indeed. Thank you, Cobus.
Thanks, Shabazz.
So this brings us now to our final presentation, which is by Mr. Dave Gove. To tell you a bit more about Mr. Gove, he is a flight operations inspector at the SACAA and oversees DFEs, examination remarks and moderation for helicopter pilots. He also has several thousands of hours flying aircraft in many countries around the world. And he's also a pilot instructor and a fixed wing and on both fixed wing and rotor wing aircraft. So the topic and the final presentation for this morning, which Mr. Gove will tell us about, is the 12 helicopter pitfalls and CFIT, controlled flight into terrain. And again, as mentioned, please continue to add your questions for Mr. Gove, and Mr. Gove will be in a position to answer those questions and keep the session interactive. With that being said, I'd like to welcome Mr. Gove for his presentation.
Presentation overview. The introduction will cover an outline, definition, aim and objectives. The aim is exposing the serial killer that we know as an EFA, extreme flying accidents, which will be discussing a CFIT helicopter accident. The objectives is to identify 12 classic accident pitfalls and to cover accident scenario 8017. We'll conclude with regard to the 12 classic accident pitfalls, and we should be running for approximately 30 to 35 minutes in this presentation. Classic pitfall number 1, responding to peer pressure. This is a poor decision-making emotional response to peers, rather than evaluating the situation objectively. Classic pitfall 2, mental expectancy. The inability to recognize and cope with the changes in the situation different to that anticipated or even planned. Visual illusions and other similar sounds occurring in the wrong time often lead to such a misuse. Classic pitfall number 3, get-tailitis. This is a disease that many pilots commonly have, and it imparts their vision and their judgment, causing them to have a fixation, and they get overwhelmed and they just want to continue and get on with their mission plan. And it's also a causal factor that can create an accident. Classic pitfall number 4, the duck under syndrome. Okay, and this is the tendency to do a sneak peek by observing what's below the minimums, and during an approach based on the belief that there's a way or some sort of safety margin that can be used, and there's an unwillingness to admit defeat and rather shoot the missed approach. Classic pitfall number 5, scud running. Very dangerous one, this, guys. Pushing the capabilities of the pilot and the aircraft to the limit by trying to maintain a visual contact with the terrain and trying to avoid a physical contact with it. Classic pitfall number 6, continuing VFR into IMC. All the often result of this practice is usually when who've been doing scud running, and the other alternative is basically you're going to go into an IFR scenario. But most of these cases, especially if the pilot is not instrument qualified or is unwilling to believe what his instruments are indicating, ends up as a CFIT. Classic pitfall number 7, getting behind the aircraft. This is when you allow events or a situation to control your actions rather than the other way around. This is characterized by a constant state of surprise and what happens next. Classic pitfall number 8, and this is loss of positional and situational awareness. Another case of getting behind the aircraft, which results in not knowing where you are and the inability to recognize deteriorating circumstances and the misjudgment of the rate of deterioration. Classic pitfall number 9, operating without sufficient fuel. So ignoring the minimum fuel reserve requirements under either visual flight rules or instrument flight rules. This is greatly the result of the overconfidence, a lack of flight planning, or deliberately ignoring what the regulations state. Classic pitfall 10, descending below your minimum en route altitude. It's like duck-under syndrome, as mentioned earlier. It manifests itself during the en route portion of the IFR operation. Classic pitfall 11. This is flying outside the envelope. This is unjustified reliance, usually mistaken, in the belief that the aircraft's high performance capabilities and demands imposed by the pilots usually underestimated high performance flying skills. Classic pitfall number 12. The neglect of flight planning, checks, and pre-flights. It's unjustified reliance on the pilots' usually overestimated short and long-term memory of regular flying skills, of repetitive and familiar routes, etc. Okay, this summarizes our 12 classic pitfalls, and be sure to take note of those and consider those factors before you go fly next time. Accident scenario 8017. In fact, the helicopter we see there is the BO-105, which is actually the helicopter involved in this scenario. Right, this is an executive summary from an accident report pulled off the Civil Aviation Authority's website. And it's always a good idea to have a look at all those factors, which we're actually going to be covering a little later. Okay, this is a map used to show the track of what the aircraft flew. Well, it got airborne from George and it flew out to an area in Haarlem. And it covered 45.2 nautical miles and an elapsed time of 25 minutes. On the 2nd of October 2005, at approximately 16:15 Zulu, the helicopter dispatched from George to go and pick up a patient that was involved in a car accident near the Longkloof Road. And the aircraft landed at approximately 16:40 Zulu. All right, the helicopter was at the road accident site approximately an hour and 10 minutes before taking off, and this is known as scene time. This could be that due to the condition of the patient, they are given a priority group, and from there they determine if they can do what they call an immediate takeoff or a hot loading. And then of course you've got your different priority codes and colors, and I believe this patient was possibly a P2 or a P1. That's a photograph of the site where the helicopter landed to pick up the patient. You can see the mountainous terrain on either side of the road. Right, the helicopter got airborne and it flew, or the distance from takeoff till the accident site was about 4 nautical miles. But what is interesting is the aircraft was in the air for approximately 40 minutes. So it was 17:50 Zulu when they took off with the patient. And one should also consider it's now nighttime, and it was 18:30, which is quite a while later, the aircraft crashed in the mountains near Haarlem. And the aircraft was completely destroyed, and unfortunately all aboard perished. There's a photograph of the accident site. On the side of the mountain you can see a lot of the burn damage, with the foliage in this picture. There's a photograph of some of the remains of the helicopter, and you can see as this aircraft impacted the mountain, you can see the forces involved. There must have been absolutely severe. Okay, referring to the accident report. The name of the operator was the Air Ambulance Service of the Red Cross. The manufacturer of the helicopter was the Balco Division. And this was a BO-105S. The nationality of South African. The registration was Romeo Mike Romeo. Place was Harlem, 2nd of October 2005 at 18:30 Zulu. Pilot in command was South African. He was male, 35 years of age, valid license. He was type rated. And he had various ratings: instructor, instrument, test pilot and night rating, which were all valid. And his medical expiry date was on the 31st of October 2005. He had no restrictions and he had no previous accidents. His experience in total time was 1,779.7 hours. And I found what was interesting is his total hours in the past 90 days was 4.6. His total time that he had in the last 90 days was 4.6. And the total on type was 4.6. The meteorological information, the winds were at 180 degrees at 5 knots. The visibility was unknown, cloud cover was unknown, and the temperature was 11 degrees Celsius and the dew point temperature was 8. So we had a 3-degree dew point temperature spread. Now, interesting enough is if we look at the moon state, it was only 1.1% illumination. So the combination of no moon, literally a black sky, with some form of visible moisture forming, could have been low-level cloud or stratus type. Once you fly into that condition, it's absolutely darkness. It's what they call an IFR scenario. All right, the aircraft was equipped with standard navigational equipment for that aircraft type. At the time of the accident, there was no communication with the air traffic control. This is due to the mountainous terrain, and normally the radios are a line of sight system. And there was no transponder scorecode given as well. All right, the conclusion of the accident report is it says the helicopter crashed in possibly cold night conditions in mountainous terrain, which fatally injured the occupants. The pilot had a valid commercial license, night rating, instrument rating and grade 3 rating. The pilot held a valid unrestricted medical certificate, and it was valid until the 12th of January 2006. The pilot was correctly licensed and he could conduct this flight safely, although he had limited experience on type. And of course the aircraft was ensued due to the impact and the ensuing fire. Right, the probable causals: CFIT, control flight into terrain, and then the contributing factors, as mentioned earlier, it's the night time. It could be this spatial disorientation and of course the poor weather conditions. All right, so with regard to the 12 accident pitfalls, what we are going to do now is we're going to group some of them and discuss what could be a possible causal factor from these 12 pitfalls. All right, so what we're doing is we're going to look at responding to peer pressure, mental expectancy, and gathellitis. Right, this could have been a causal factor. However, no evidence is there to really support that. Right, duck under syndrome, scud running. This may not have been relevant in the unfolding events of this accident, based on that the accident report did not really refer to any of this. Right, continuing VFR into IMC, getting behind the aircraft, loss of positional situational awareness. I believe this is a major contributing factor, as it was a moonless night that fateful day. And the temperature dew point spread, as mentioned earlier, was 3 degrees, possibly resulting in the formation of cloud, visible moisture, and led up to the loss of situational awareness. All right, operating without sufficient fuel, descending below minimum en route altitude. This did not seem to be a contributing factor in this accident report. Right, flying outside of the envelope or neglect of flight planning checks and pre-flight checks. This could have been a causal factor. However, no evidence is there to support this. And kindly watch the movie that will follow.
You're looking at the weather and it's legal for now. But the day's forecast calls for worsening conditions that might go below limits. Your flight today is for an important new customer that needs parts delivered 50 miles away. You rush through your weather and pre-flight and realize you'll be cutting it close with the forecast. You're informed that the parts are delayed in reaching you, and the weather isn't getting any better. You hurry through your checklists, but you got this. The weather's coming in faster than you thought, but just swing around it. If you canceled every time it looked like this, you'd never fly in this region. As visibility continues to drop, something just doesn't feel right. You gotta stay clear of clouds in this airspace.
Obstacle.
What's the height of that new transmission tower around here? Okay, this is getting sporty, and those clouds are a lot thicker. You are way too low, and now you've just punched in. You feel paralyzed. Time is standing still. You vowed never to let this happen. You now have 56 seconds to live. You're way too low, and it's like the ground is reaching up to you. Panicked, you overcorrect. In no time, you're climbing fast. You now have 45 seconds to live. Now you feel like you're turning and tumbling all at the same time and have lost faith in your instruments. You now have 30 seconds to live. This has become a nightmare roller coaster ride. The aircraft is screaming for your attention, but a part of you is starting to let go. Everything's darker now. You think of your family one last time. I'm sorry. Can you forgive me? But they can't hear you. Because you are out of time.
Mr. Gov now joins us for a continuation of this presentation by assisting us with some Q&A. Mr. Gov, thank you for your presentation. Indeed, very impactful and showing us the unfortunate reality of aviation in that it sometimes does result in accidents. So our first question for you, Mr. Gov, is we've heard a lot this morning about undue domineering influences. Would you say such an aspect has played a role in this particular CFIT accident?
Yes, thank you, Sebastian. Please call me Dave. I think that's a lot easier for everybody. Undue dominating influence, yes, it could have been. The investigation officially did not, as per such, say that it was a direct influence. Because normally these things also involve things like a just culture in an organization. And normally when you have got a proper functioning just culture, these domineering influences, especially if it's a management or a flight operations element in the company, that could be a causal factor in putting the pilot under pressure. Normally that could be removed, and the pilot could have that reservation of saying, no, the scenario or the weather condition is too bad to execute a safe flight. So yes, could it be a causal factor? Possibly, but in this specific investigation, there wasn't anything conclusive to point towards that as such.
Given the time of the specific accident, would you say that the time of day and fatigue might have played a meaningful role?
Sabash, I would say so, yes, because remember now, when you are operating at night, you know, you've also got your diurnal effects on your body, things like your circadian rhythms, you know, for sleep and so forth. We weren't really designed, you know, through, you could call it evolution. Our bodies weren't really designed to work at night. You know, we work in the day or hunt in the day. We go and pick berries and chase ladies in the day. But at night we normally sleep. And so the thing is, now you're forced into an environment where you are now at night. It's not within your normal bodily phase. So that would definitely add a fatiguing moment. The other thing is, you would have to try and sleep in the day and be ready for duty for a night job or a night flight. So day and night would definitely have an effect on fatigue. And again, it was the location. It was also things like, you know, the terrain involved, the weather conditions, the lighting, and also the experience of the pilot utilizing that particular aircraft.
And this all again points to there being a significant number of aspects as it relates to the aptitude of a pilot and the attitude of a pilot. With regard to the specific accident again, would you say that emotional pressure, this being needing to take a young girl to the hospital, could have played a role? And would such a scenario have an impact upon a human being who is also a pilot responsible for such a endeavor?
Sabash, absolutely. From my experience, doing Casevac flying and so forth, especially flying for United Nations and, you know, in Africa and some parts of Afghanistan, the situation is, yes, when you do have a casualty on board, there is definitely an effect. As a pilot, you feel we have to get this person to a hospital or to some place that they can, you know, deliver proper medical care. So it does add a pressure on you to you have to get there and you got to do it. And the problem is one will tend to start rushing through checks, maybe overlook something, maybe part of your checklist or a system that should have been programmed that is vital for that flight, depending on, you know, the environment you're in, whether it's day and night or mountainous terrain or, you know, if it's an IF condition or a VFR condition, you know, these factors, yes, definitely. And if it's a young girl, a young child, I think the effect would, you know, be more influencing as such than just flying passengers on a regular flight or cargo.
And to continue on this trend, a very appropriate question from an audience member.
Yes.
Would you say commercial pressures on the pilot equally play a very significant role in this regard?
Yes, well, we have to define what commercial pressures, because in any commercial flying there will always be pressures, as we know. So is it organizational pressures? You know, is it pressures in terms of maybe there's a certain element of snags on the aircraft, which where the aircraft could still fly but would have to use a minimum equipment checklist, which would now limit what you can actually do with that particular aircraft. So the commercial pressures will always be there, but again, the more experience a pilot has, normally with that experience, those type of pilots will be able to deal with the commercial pressures better. When you've got a young and upcoming pilot that's low time, that now gets put into a commercial environment, they may not know how to handle all of those commercial pressures, especially if it's an organizational pressure that doesn't have a just culture. And remember, you're young, you need the hours, and there has been organizations that have unfortunately said to young and up and coming pilots, they say, if you don't want to do the job, we'll just get somebody else. So normally they are indirectly forced into a scenario where they have to fly unsafely. or they feel they have to fly safely. And that type of attitude must be removed from operators and from pilots as well. You know, safety first. It's your limiting factor. It's your buffer zone between your safety and, you know, it literally could mean the difference between death and life.
Indeed. And safety management, there's a term which is often used, just culture. How can just culture be applied to an accident like this? Is there any benefit that culture, or the term just culture, as it relates to safety management, would it have any impact?
Well, in particular to this accident, we are not sure, based on the accident report, what the culture was of that company. It may have had a good just culture. We're not really sure of that based on the report as such. But there are organizations, there are companies where they don't have a just culture. And of course, flight crew will be forced into scenarios which would make the flight unsafe. But there are organizations that do apply just culture, you know, attitude towards how they run their organization. And a pilot may make a mistake, but what will happen is the organization will say, okay, you made a mistake, but now we're not going to be here to give you a big hiding, but what we're going to do is say, help us determine a process that we can put in place so that that mistake doesn't happen again in future. Not just for you, but for the rest of the flight crew in this organization. So, you know, implication or application of that, applying that in an organization would be a very, very good thing to improve the level of safety. But now if we have to go and look at general aviation, which doesn't involve companies and it's people flying privately or such, could actually consider having a just culture mindset, that they're not influenced by their passengers. They're not influenced by anybody outside of their pilot mind that could influence them to take an unnecessary risk, which may end up as a bad incident or worse, an accident.
Just to continue on that, are there any techniques that you have learned personally in how to keep your mind isolated from those external environments which could contribute to an accident?
So Bash, yes, through the years, but again, this comes with experience. A very low-time pilot is still learning. You may be a commercial pilot with 200 hours, but when I was a commercial pilot at 200 hours, I knew nothing. And the thing is, it took many years to learn so many other areas of aviation. And even today, I've got many thousands of hours. I'm still learning. So first of all, keep learning. I would say, don't waste time on fickle things. If you've got time, use that to go and study. Go and learn new things. Go and learn about new systems in aircraft. Go learn about things like, you know, CRM and so forth. Try and add more richness to what you already know. Continue to do that. The other thing is also check yourself, because for me, flying starts when you climb in the car and you drive into the airport. Because for myself, my point of view is I look at the weather. What's the weather today? Okay, what is that? We've got a bit of cirrus there. We've got a bit of fair weather cumulus here. Temperatures so much. We'll get the Met report when I get to the airport. When I get close to the airport, is the circuit full or is it empty? Things like that. So my flight has technically started already. And then there's that concept of I'm focusing on what I'm going to do for this flight today. So normally I have a plan already rehearsed in my head. The active runway is, say, runway 29. I know what the runway looks like. I've done many touch and goes on it. I'm going to request to go to a general flying area or fly to another airfield. So I've mentally prepared myself for that, and I'm going to think when I arrive at the other airfield, I'm going to observe what the wind direction is, and I'm going to decide, which way am I going to land? Where's the circuit going to lie? You know, is it going to be a left or right-hand circuit? Is there other traffic involved? Now, I know this is more fixed wing, but the same applies for helicopters. So it's a case of rehearse in your mind before you actually take that flight. Plan the flight, fly the plan. Know your aircraft, know its systems. Make sure you have checked all of other factors, the weather. Do your weight and balance. Make sure you haven't overloaded the aircraft. And then, of course, enjoy the flight. Don't walk in there a ball of nerves. This is fun. Flying is fun. But make sure you follow in the sequence of those checks. That's how I approach it.
Well, I do thank you for sharing that. That's your very own technique. And of course, where you say when you leave your home, you're already preparing for the flight. You're looking outside. There is no regulation prescribing that one should do so. But what you're alluding to is the pilot should take ultimate responsibility. Correct. And that starts as soon as he leaves, he or she, of course, leaves their home. So we thank you for sharing. And that's obviously worked for you because you're still with us today.
Yes, and also again, you are the pilot in command. It is your responsibility to say no if it's unsafe. No one has got the right to force you into doing something that's unnecessary. Rather cancel the flight and fly another day. It's better to not fly than die. Keep it safe.
So, Mr. Gov, this takes us to another question from our audience members. Could a loss of situational, geographic, and positional awareness, could it have played a role in the Seaford accident?
Yes, absolutely. As mentioned in the the previous clip, as you could see, the aircraft got airborne from the road accident scene to collect the casualty, the passenger. And they were in the air for 40 minutes, but from liftoff to impact was only 4 nautical miles. So that aircraft, that helicopter was in the air for 40 minutes. What was that pilot doing over a elapsed time of 40 minutes and only covered 4 nautical miles before that fatal accident occurred? And I would definitely say yes, situational awareness was a big factor. Based on the scenario, the moonlight. It was at night, so no moonlight, or literally no moonlight. At night, there may be invisible moisture forming in the form of clouds because of the temperature dew point spread. This guy was flying in absolute darkness, and the only thing he had is whatever instrumentation he had on board. And the question is, how could he have been in that area for 40 minutes before impacting that mountain? You know, in hindsight, there were so many arguments. He could have flew a track in line with the main road and just continued climbing until he was way above the highest point, in that area, and just fly straight to George. But we don't know what happened exactly in that flight, but it had to involve situational awareness. The other causal factors could have been pressure because of what was happening in the back of that aircraft with the patient on board. And as I circled everything out in my presentation, I think this is where it alludes to those areas that were the causal factors of that fatal accident.
And Dave, our final question to you is also again on this accident.
Yes.
This pilot was instrument rated. Could additional avionic equipment such as EGPWS or autopilot, could the installation of such avionic equipment have assisted such an accident?
Indeed, it would. But again, I am not too familiar with or sure precisely what equipment was on that aircraft. That BO-105 has been doing many night CASEVACs, ops missions as such. But that particular one, I think, because of the experience of the pilot, as you could see, 6.4 hours, that's very low to operate quite a complex machine in an environment like that. Those factors, regardless of equipment on board, may have been an overriding factor that led up to that accident. But yes, sure, GPWS would have been a fantastic thing to have, but I'm unsure based on the report if it was fitted with a GPWS and such.
Well, thank you, Mr. Dave Gov. That's all the time we have this morning for questions and answers. But we do thank you for sharing this again, very impactful presentation this morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Subhash.
So this brings us now to the closure of this morning's event and the inaugural GARS, the General Aviation Accident Reduction Seminar, the first seminar, and of course conducted online. I'd like to thank all speakers this morning. We've had 5 speakers this morning, and certainly we've been left enriched from all of the discussions this morning. There's a few key themes that have come out of this discussion this morning, and the one that stands out clearly is that safety is never ending. And of course, the intention behind the seminar is to save your life. If you are an aviator, it's to keep you safe in the sky. And we'd encourage you to please continue the discussions, continue with keeping South Africa's airspace safe as best as you can. And of course, the willingness from our presenters and speakers this morning is much appreciated. And we'd like to also implore you to share these presentations with others that you might feel would benefit from these. With that being said, it does bring us to the end. I thank all of you audience members for attending this morning, and I can confirm that this was well worth your time. With that being said, thank you.